Welcome to another video on stories of our history. Picture the moment of impact. A massive counterweight trebuchet, its wooden arm groaning under the strain, releases a stone the size of a wine barrel, sending it hurtling across the sky toward a fortress wall. The sound of the release is a deep, resonant thrum that vibrates through the chests of the defenders, a sound they have learned to dread over the long weeks of the siege. In the feudal castles of 11th century Europe, that wall was a vertical face of rough-hewn stone, rising sheer from the ground, designed to be tall rather than resilient, its blocks laid in courses that had been determined by the availability of local material rather than by any calculation of the stresses of artillery fire. The stone would strike, and the wall would shudder, cracks spider-webbing outward from the point of impact, the mortar crumbling into dust and the stones themselves beginning to shift, and if the bombardment continued long enough, the wall would collapse outward in a cascade of rubble, opening a breach for the attackers to storm with a shout of triumph. But in the Holy Land in the late 12th century, that same stone would strike a very different kind of wall. It would hit a smooth, sloping surface of polished masonry, angled outward at precisely 60 degrees, a surface that was designed not to resist the impact but to redirect it, to take the immense kinetic energy of the flying stone and turn it against the stone itself. The stone would skid upward along the talus, its kinetic energy dissipated into a shower of sparks and rock fragments that glittered in the sun like a deadly rainbow, and it would tumble harmlessly to the base of the wall, leaving the fortress unscathed and the attackers staring in frustration at the unbroken barrier. This talus, or glacis, was just one of the revolutionary innovations that the Knights Templar introduced to the art of fortification, innovations that transformed the castles of the Holy Land from passive shelters into active instruments of defense that could kill as well as protect. The story of Templar military architecture is the story of a brutal and brilliant collision of cultures, a fusion of European mass, Armenian ingenuity, and Byzantine subtlety that produced the most formidable fortresses of the medieval world, fortresses whose principles still inform the design of military strongpoints in the modern age. The Templars did not arrive in the East as architectural innovators, for the order in its earliest years was composed primarily of knights from the noble houses of France and Flanders, men whose experience of castles was limited to the great keeps of the Loire and the Rhineland, structures that had been built by their fathers and grandfathers for the private wars of the feudal aristocracy. These European castles were designed for a different kind of warfare, the intermittent, small-scale conflicts of feudal lords who fought with limited resources and limited ambition, wars that were more about ransom and reputation than about the control of territory or the destruction of an enemy. A baron's castle in Europe was built to overawe his neighbors, to resist a few weeks of siege by a rival with a few hundred men, and to serve as a residence and a center of administration where the lord could hold court, collect his rents, and display the wealth that was the foundation of his power. Its design emphasized height, with walls that soared upward to provide a commanding view of the surrounding countryside and to make escalade difficult, the height itself a statement of the lord's dominance over the landscape and its people. The plan was often a simple rectangle, a massive stone box with towers at the corners, the towers projecting slightly from the wall face to provide flanking fire along the curtain. But the towers were square, with corners that created dead zones where attackers could shelter from the fire of the defenders. The keep, the dungeon, was the heart of the castle, a single massive tower that contained the lord's apartments, the great hall where he feasted his guests, and the final refuge if the outer walls fell, a last redoubt that was often built on a mound or a rocky outcrop that added natural height to its already formidable elevation. This European model was brought to the Holy Land by the first Crusaders, who had grown up in the shadow of these great keeps and who naturally sought to replicate them in the land they had conquered. The early fortresses of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, built in the decades after the capture of the Holy City in 1099, were essentially European castles transplanted to the Levant, their builders adapting the familiar forms to the unfamiliar terrain with varying degrees of success. The Tower of David in Jerusalem, the citadel that guarded the city's western gate, was a typical example of this early Crusader architecture, a massive square keep built on the foundations of earlier Roman and Muslim fortifications, its walls vertical and its corners angular, its design a statement of Frankish power in the heart of the conquered city. The castle of Turin, built by the lords of Transjordan on a hill overlooking the Jordan Valley, was another early example, a square keep with square towers at its corners, its walls thick and high but its plan simple, its builders relying on mass rather than on sophistication to resist the attacks of the Muslim armies that were already beginning to probe the defenses of the new kingdom. These early castles served their purpose for a time, providing secure bases from which the Frankish knights could dominate the surrounding countryside, but the conditions of warfare in the Levant were radically different from those in Europe, and the European model, transplanted to this harsh and hostile environment, quickly revealed its fatal weaknesses as the Muslim powers developed more effective siege techniques. The climate of the Holy Land was an adversary in its own right, a relentless sun that baked the stone walls during the long summer months, heating the interior of the castles to temperatures that could kill a man in his armor, followed by winter rains that seeped into the mortar and froze, causing cracks and spalling as the water expanded within the pores of the stone. The seismic tremors that periodically shook the region, the same tremors that had destroyed the cities of the ancient world, added another dimension of threat, their vibrations toppling walls that had been designed for the stable ground of northern Europe. The Muslim armies that the Templars faced were not the feudal levies of a French baron, a collection of peasants with pitchforks and knights who served for 40 days before returning to their harvests. These were professional forces, commanded by emirs who had access to the most advanced siege technology of the age, including the counterweight trebuchet, a weapon that could hurl stones weighing over 100 kilograms with enough force to shatter the stoutest wall, the mining sap, a technique that bypassed the walls entirely and attacked the foundations beneath them, and the terrifying liquid flame known as Greek fire, a sticky, burning naphtha that clung to flesh and stone and could not be extinguished by water. These armies could bring tens of thousands of soldiers to bear on a single fortress, and they could sustain a siege for months or even years, their supply lines stretching back to Egypt or Syria, their camps a permanent city that grew around the besieged castle. The European square keep, with its vertical walls and its corners that acted as stress concentrators, was particularly vulnerable to the mining operations that the Muslim sappers conducted with terrifying efficiency, a vulnerability that the Templars had observed with growing alarm in the early decades of the Order's existence. A mine, dug beneath a corner of the keep by sappers who worked in the dark, their progress hidden by wooden mantlets and the cover of arrow barrages, could bring down a section of wall in a matter of weeks once the timber props were set alight and the tunnel collapsed. The corner of a square tower concentrated the force of the collapse, acting as a hinge around which the walls would crack and fall, and the resulting breach was often large enough for a column of infantry to storm through. The garrison, trapped inside a rectangular shell that had been designed to resist assault from the top but not from the bottom, had no way to defend against this threat except by making desperate sallies that exposed them to slaughter in the open ground between the walls and the enemy lines. The Templars, who studied every defeat with the cold eye of military analysts, who interviewed the survivors of fallen castles and who recorded the details of every siege in the archives that were later lost, recognized that a new kind of fortress was needed, one that was adapted to the specific threats of the Levantine battlefield, one that could resist the mine, the trebuchet, and the fire. The Armenian masons, whose ancestors had been building fortresses in the seismic mountains of the Caucasus for millennia, were the first teachers from whom the Templars learned a different approach, a tradition of construction that had been shaped by the violent geology of their homeland. The Armenians had developed a tradition of constructing round towers rather than square ones, a design that eliminated the vulnerable corners that were the target of mining operations and that distributed the force of an earthquake or a trebuchet impact more evenly through the structure, the curved surface acting as a natural arch that transferred the load downward into the foundations. A round tower had no corner where a sapper could dig his mine without being exposed to flanking fire from the adjacent walls, and its curved surface deflected stones and arrows, reducing the energy of an impact by spreading it across a larger area, a principle that the Templars, with their practical understanding of mechanics, immediately grasped. The Armenian churches and fortresses of Cilicia, the kingdom that the Armenian refugees had established in southeastern Anatolia after the Seljuk conquest of their homeland, were models of this kind of construction, their cylindrical towers rising from the crags with a grace that belied their immense strength, their walls surviving earthquakes that had shattered the square towers of the European-style castles. The Templars, who were closely allied with the Armenian princes through treaties of mutual defense and intermarriage, and who employed Armenian masons in their building projects, absorbed this knowledge and began to incorporate round towers into their own designs, a transformation that can be traced through the archaeological record over the course of the 12th century. The Byzantine Empire, the eastern half of the Roman world that had held the line against Islam for 4 centuries before the First Crusade, was the second great source of Templar architectural innovation, a source that the order accessed through its diplomatic and military contacts with Constantinople. The Byzantines had developed a sophisticated defensive system based on the concept of the limes, a network of mutually supporting fortresses connected by beacon fires and mounted couriers, a system that had been refined over centuries of warfare against the Persians, the Arabs, and the Turks. The Byzantines had also refined the use of the Talus, the sloped masonry facing that would become the signature of Templar fortification, a technique that had originally been developed by Roman military engineers for the fortifications of the Danube frontier. The Talus had been adapted by the Byzantines to the stone-throwing artillery of the Islamic armies, creating a smooth, angled surface that was almost immune to bombardment, the stones skidding upward and losing their energy before they could damage the wall. The Talus also served a second purpose, one that was equally important in the close-quarters combat of a siege. It prevented attackers from placing scaling ladders against the wall, because the ladder would slide down the smooth, sloping surface, and it made it difficult for sappers to approach the base of the wall, because they were exposed to fire from the battlements for the entire length of their approach. The sloped surface offering no cover. The Templars, who had close contact with Byzantine military engineers during the reign of Emperor Manuel I Komnenos, when the order served as a bridge between the Latin and Greek worlds, adopted the Talus and pushed it to its logical extreme, creating walls that sloped outward from the base like the prow of a ship, their surface polished to a glassy smoothness that offered no purchase to climbers or to the wedges of sappers. The concentric castle, the greatest single innovation of Crusader military architecture, was a design that the Templars perfected through a synthesis of these various influences, a synthesis that was driven by the desperate need to hold a frontier with a fraction of the enemy's numbers. The basic idea was simple, but its execution required a level of planning and precision that was rare in the medieval world. Instead of a single line of walls, the castle would have 2 or even 3 concentric rings, with the inner walls rising higher than the outer ones, so that the defenders on the inner walls could fire over the heads of the defenders on the outer walls. An attacker who breached the outer wall would find himself in a narrow space between the walls, a killing zone where he was exposed to fire from the inner wall and from the towers that flanked the gap, a space that had been deliberately designed to be a death trap. There was no escape from this space. The only way forward was through another gate, which was itself a fortress within a fortress, protected by its own Barbican, its own portcullises, and its own garrison, and the only way back was through the breach that had been created, which the defenders would immediately counterattack with a sally of knights and sergeants. The concentric castle was a machine for turning a breach into a massacre, and the Templar castles of Safed, Chastel-Pellerin, and Tortosa were among the earliest and most sophisticated examples of this design anywhere in the world, their concentric plans studied and copied by the military engineers of the succeeding centuries. The Barbican, the fortified outwork that projected from the gate, was another Templar innovation that transformed the weakest point of a castle, the entrance, into its strongest, a transformation that had a profound psychological impact on the attackers. In European castles, the gate was often a simple opening in the wall, protected by a portcullis and a pair of doors, and if the gate was forced, the attacker was inside the castle, and the defenders had to fight a desperate melee in the courtyard or retreat to the keep. The Templars, learning from the experience of 100 sieges, developed a system of barbicans that made the gate a death trap, a place where the attacker's numerical superiority became a liability. The Barbican was a walled enclosure that projected outward from the main gate, its own gate offset from the main gate so that a charging enemy would crash into a solid wall of stone and be forced to turn, exposing his flank to the fire of the defenders on the walls above. The passage through the Barbican was narrow, lined with murder holes through which the defenders could pour boiling water, heated sand, and Greek fire, and it was flanked by towers that provided enfilading fire along its entire length. The Barbican was a killing box, a space from which there was no exit except through the inner gate, which was sealed, or back through the outer gate, which was now blocked by the press of attackers behind them, and its design was a masterpiece of defensive engineering that the Templars refined over decades of trial and error. The elimination of blind spots was a guiding principle of Templar castle design, a principle that distinguished their fortresses from the castles of Europe, and that reflected the Order's commitment to the systematic application of geometry to the art of war. In a European keep, the corners of the square tower created dead zones where attackers could shelter from the fire of the defenders, spaces that were invisible to the archers on the battlements, and that provided a safe haven from which an assault could be launched. The vertical walls meant that a soldier at the base of the wall was invisible to the archers on the battlements above, the angle of the parapet blocking the line of sight, and this blind spot was the place where the sapper did his work, the place where the scaling ladder was placed, the place where the attack was most dangerous. The Templars eliminated these blind spots through a combination of round towers, which provided a continuous field of fire along the curtain wall without any corners to create shadows, projecting machicolations, which allowed defenders to drop stones and fire directly downward onto the heads of attackers at the base of the wall, and splayed arrow loops, which allowed a crossbowman inside the tower to cover a wide angle of approach while presenting only a narrow slit to the enemy's return fire. The result was a fortress that had no hidden corners, no sheltered spaces where an attacker could pause and regroup, and every square meter of the approach was covered by the crossbows of the defenders. The continuous innovation of the Templar architectural program was not merely a matter of adopting foreign techniques. It was a process of systematic experimentation and refinement that was documented in the Order's now lost archives, a process that was as rigorous as any modern engineering development. The Templar engineers, many of whom were lay brothers who had spent their entire lives studying the art of construction, would analyze the performance of their castles after each siege, noting the weaknesses that had been exploited by the enemy and the innovations that had proven effective. They would interview the survivors of the garrison, examining the scars on the walls and the patterns of damage, and they would compile reports that were circulated among the preceptories of the Holy Land. The results of this analysis were incorporated into the design of the next castle, and over the course of the 12th and 13th centuries, the Templar fortress evolved into a type that was almost perfectly adapted to the conditions of warfare in the Holy Land. This process of continuous improvement is visible in the archaeological record, where earlier castles show a mixture of European and Eastern features, their towers sometimes square, sometimes polygonal, their walls sometimes vertical, sometimes sloped, while later castles are purely Templar in their design, their architecture a unique fusion that could not be mistaken for anything else. The Templar castle was a living tradition, a tradition that was passed from master to apprentice, from generation to generation, and its evolution is a testament to the Order's commitment to excellence in every aspect of its military mission, from the training of the knights to the laying of the stones. The survival of the Crusader states for nearly 2 centuries in the face of overwhelming Muslim numerical superiority is, in large part, a testament to the success of Templar military architecture, a success that is all the more remarkable given the internal divisions and the political weaknesses of the Frankish kingdom. Time and again, the destruction of the Christian field army at battles such as Hattin in 1187 and La Fourby in 1244 was followed by the survival of the kingdom behind the walls of its fortresses, the shattered remnants of the army retreating to the castles and the civilians of the surrounding districts flocking to the gates for protection. The castles that the Templars built were the strategic reserve of the Crusader cause, the unbreakable shield behind which the kingdom could recover from its defeats and prepare its counterstrokes. The Mamluk Sultan Baybars, who spent the 1260s and 1270s systematically reducing the Crusader fortresses, found that each castle cost him more in casualties and time than the conquest of an entire province, and his chroniclers recorded his frustration with the walls that refused to fall. The walls that the Templars raised were the reason that the Holy Land remained in Christian hands long after the military balance of power had shifted decisively against the Franks. And the story of Templar military architecture is not merely a chapter in the history of engineering, it is a chapter in the history of survival, a testament to the power of human ingenuity to resist the tide of history itself. The European architectural heritage that the Templars brought with them to the Holy Land was defined by the massive, rectangular stone keeps that still dominate the landscapes of France, England, and the Rhineland, monuments to the feudal order that had shaped the society from which the first brothers of the order had come. These keeps, such as the Tower of London built by William the Conqueror in the 1070s and the Dungeon of Locks in the Loire Valley raised by the Counts of Anjou, were statements of power as much as they were military installations. Their sheer bulk intended to overawe a subject population and to demonstrate the wealth and authority of the lord who built them. The walls of a typical European keep rose vertically from the ground to a height of 30 or 40 meters, their thickness tapering from as much as 4 meters at the base to 2 meters at the summit, with narrow window openings that were designed to admit light while denying entry to an attacker, and a single entrance often placed high above the ground and accessible only by a removable wooden stair or a defended forebuilding. The plan was a simple square or rectangle, with buttresses at the corners to provide additional strength and towers that projected slightly from the wall face to provide flanking fire along the curtain, the towers themselves square and the fire they provided limited by the corners that created blind spots. The interior was divided into a series of superimposed halls, with the great hall on the upper floor where the lord entertained his guests and conducted his business, and storage chambers and guard rooms below, the whole structure capped with a crenellated fighting platform where archers and crossbowmen could stand during a siege, their heads protected by the merlins and their arrows loosed through the gaps. These keeps were immensely strong, capable of resisting the assaults of a rival baron's army for weeks or even months, and their psychological impact on the medieval landscape was profound. They were the thrones of the feudal order, the physical embodiment of the power that the aristocracy wielded over the land and its people, and their construction was one of the great engineering achievements of the early Middle Ages. But the European keep was designed for a specific kind of warfare, the private wars of the feudal aristocracy, and its transfer to the radically different environment of the Holy Land exposed a series of fatal weaknesses that the Templars would spend decades correcting. Weaknesses that were rooted in the fundamental geometry of the square plan. The first and most obvious weakness was the square plan itself, with its 4 corners that acted as natural targets for the sappers and miners who were the terror of every Crusader garrison, a vulnerability that had been recognized by military engineers since the time of the Romans but that the feudal builders of Europe had been unable to address. A square tower, when subjected to the shock of a trebuchet impact or the undermining of its foundations, concentrated the stress at its corners, which acted as hinges around which the walls would crack and collapse, the force of the impact traveling along the line of the wall and being amplified at the corner where 2 walls met. The mining technique, perfected by the Muslim engineers of Syria and Egypt over centuries of siege warfare, was to dig a tunnel beneath a corner of the tower, prop the roof of the tunnel with timber supports, and then set fire to the timbers, a technique that required patience, skill, and a willingness to work in the dark and the dust for weeks on end. The fire would burn through the props, the roof of the tunnel would collapse, and the corner of the tower above would fall into the void, bringing a section of the wall with it, and opening a breach that the infantry could storm. A square tower had 4 such corners, each of which was a potential point of collapse, and defending against a mine required the garrison to countermine, digging their own tunnels to intercept the enemy sappers, a desperate and dangerous operation that was conducted in the dark, by the light of candles, and that often ended in failure when the 2 tunnels met and the miners fought hand to hand in the suffocating darkness. The second weakness of the European model was its vertical wall face, which provided an ideal surface for the battering rams, siege towers, and scaling ladders that were the standard equipment of an attacking army, a surface that had been designed for appearance and for height rather than for the deflection of projectiles. A vertical wall offered a flat surface against which a ram could be brought to bear, its iron head swinging in a steady rhythm that would eventually shatter the stone and create a breach, the force of each blow transmitted directly into the wall. A siege tower, rolled up to the wall on its massive wheels under the cover of a rain of arrows, could drop its drawbridge directly onto the battlements, allowing the attackers to storm the parapet without ever having to climb a ladder, the tower itself a moving fortress that neutralized the height advantage of the defenders. A scaling ladder, leaned against the wall, would rest securely against the vertical surface, the top of the ladder lodging against the crenellations, and the attackers could swarm up it under the cover of their archers' fire, the speed of the assault overwhelming the defenders before they could respond. The European response to these threats was to build walls higher, making the ladders longer and the siege towers taller. But this was an arms race that the defenders could not win, because there was a practical limit to the height of a stone wall, and the attackers could always build a taller tower. The Templars, observing the effectiveness of the sloped, angled walls that the Byzantines had built on their eastern frontier, realized that the solution was not to build higher but to build smarter, creating a wall that presented no flat surface for the enemy to exploit, a wall that turned the enemy's own momentum against him. The third weakness was the relative simplicity of the gate defenses, a simplicity that reflected the limited resources and the limited ambitions of the feudal builders who had constructed the European castles. In a European castle, the gate was typically a single portal in the curtain wall, protected by a portcullis, a pair of heavy wooden doors, and perhaps a drawbridge over a dry moat, a defense that was adequate against a raiding party but that could not withstand the concentrated assault of a professional army. If the gate was forced, by ram, by fire, or by treachery, the attacker was inside the castle, and the defenders had to retreat to the keep or fight a desperate melee in the courtyard, a battle that was often lost because the attackers could fan out and overwhelm the defenders with numbers. The gate was the Achilles heel of the European fortress, and its defense relied on a single layer of protection that, once breached, could not be replaced, a weakness that the Templars had seen exploited in the early sieges of the Crusader period. The Templars, who had seen the gates of their own castles forced by Muslim armies in the early years of the Crusader period, when the order was still learning the art of fortress defense, developed a multi-layered system of gate defense that transformed the entrance from a weakness into a strength, a system that was the product of decades of trial and error, and that incorporated every lesson that had been learned in the bitter school of siege warfare. The fourth weakness of the European model was its limited capacity for providing enfilading fire, the flanking shots that could sweep along the face of a wall and catch attackers in the side as they advanced, a weakness that was a consequence of the square towers and the vertical walls. A square tower projecting from a curtain wall could provide some enfilading fire, but the corners of the tower created dead zones where attackers could shelter, spaces that were invisible to the archers on the battlements, and that provided a safe approach to the base of the wall. The vertical wall face meant that a soldier at the base of the wall was invisible to the archers on the parapet, the angle of the parapet blocking the line of sight, and this blind spot was the place where the enemy concentrated his efforts, the place where the ram was brought to bear and the mine was dug. The Templars, drawing on the Armenian and Byzantine traditions of round towers, created a system of projection and curvature that eliminated these dead zones entirely, a system that was based on the principle of interlocking fields of fire that would not be fully articulated until the age of gunpowder. A round tower, with its continuous curved surface, allowed archers to fire in all directions, covering the entire approach to the wall without any gaps, and the towers were placed at carefully calculated intervals so that their fields of fire overlapped, creating a continuous curtain of crossbow bolts that an attacker had to penetrate. The Templar castle was a structure designed around the principle of interlocking fire, and its design was a generation ahead of any other fortress in the world. The cultural shock of encountering the sophisticated siege techniques of the Muslim armies was the catalyst that forced the Templars to abandon their European preconceptions and embrace a new approach to fortress design, a process of adaptation that was driven by the survival instinct of the order. The siege of Jerusalem in 1099 had demonstrated the power of the counterweight trebuchet, a weapon that could hurl stones weighing over 100 kilograms with enough force to shatter the stoutest wall, a weapon that the Franks themselves had used to breach the walls of the Holy City. The siege of Tyre in 1124 had shown the effectiveness of the mining sap, which could bring down a tower without the attacker ever having to expose himself to the fire of the defenders, the mine being dug in secret, and the defenders only learning of its existence when the ground began to shake and the wall began to crack. The Templars, who were present at these and many other sieges, compiled a mental catalogue of the threats that their fortresses would have to face, a catalogue that was passed from generation to generation in the oral tradition of the order, and that informed every aspect of their building program. They set about designing a castle that could resist each of these threats, a castle that would be immune to the trebuchet, impervious to the mine, and lethal to the attacker. And this process of cultural adaptation was not a single event but a continuous evolution that spanned the entire history of the order, each generation of Templar engineers building on the knowledge of the previous generation. The integration of these diverse influences, European mass, Armenian roundness, Byzantine slope, into a coherent Templar style was the work of a corps of master masons and engineers whose names have mostly been lost to history but whose work remains, a silent testimony to their skill and their dedication. These men, many of whom were lay brothers of the order who had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, dedicated their lives to the study and practice of military construction, traveling between the preceptories of the Holy Land to inspect the castles, supervise the repairs, and plan the new constructions that the Grand Master had ordered. They consulted with local masons, with captured Muslim engineers who were willing to share their knowledge in exchange for their lives or for the promise of payment, and with the veteran knights who had survived the sieges and who could describe the weaknesses that the enemy had exploited, the places where the wall had cracked, the gate that had been forced, the tower that had fallen. The Templar castle was not the product of a single genius but of a corporate intelligence, a collective mind that absorbed information from every source and synthesized it into a design that was greater than the sum of its parts, a design that was the physical expression of the order's commitment to excellence in every aspect of its mission. This corporate approach to architecture was unique in the medieval world, and it allowed the Templars to innovate at a pace that no secular lord, with his limited resources and his dependence on a single master mason, could match. The survival of the Crusader states through the repeated disasters of the 12th and 13th centuries was a testament to the effectiveness of the Templar architectural program, which provided the strategic depth that the kingdom needed to absorb the shock of defeat. After the disaster at Hattin in 1187, when the field army of the kingdom was destroyed and the king was captured, the castles that the Templars had built provided the refuges from which the Frankish presence was gradually restored, the garrisons holding out against the victorious Saracens and providing the bases for the counterattacks of the Third Crusade. After the disaster at La Fourby in 1244, when the last great field army of the kingdom was annihilated by the Khwarezmian mercenaries, the castles again provided the defense behind which the Frankish cities could prepare for the final Mamluk onslaught. The Templar castle was the strategic reserve of the Crusader cause, and its design was the product of a deliberate, systematic effort to maximize the defensive power of every man and every stone, an effort that was born of the recognition that the survival of the Holy Land depended on the quality of its fortresses. The walls that the Templars raised were the reason that the Crusader states endured for as long as they did, and their story is an essential chapter in the military history of the medieval world. The contribution of Armenian Masons to the development of Templar military architecture is a story that has been obscured by the passage of time and by the destruction of the Templar archives, but that is essential to understanding the evolution of the Crusader castle from a simple European keep to a sophisticated Eastern fortress. The Armenians, an ancient Christian people whose kingdom in the Caucasus had been overrun by the Seljuk Turks in the 11th century, had established a new homeland in Cilicia, the mountainous region of southeastern Anatolia that lay just north of the Crusader states, a kingdom that was a natural ally of the Franks in their struggle against the Muslim powers. The Armenian princes, particularly the Rupenid dynasty that ruled Cilicia from its capital at Sis, were close allies of the Franks, bound by treaties of mutual defense and by the bonds of intermarriage, and many Armenian nobles married into the Crusader aristocracy, creating a web of kinship that bound the two Christian powers together against the common enemy. The Armenians had a long and sophisticated tradition of stone construction, a tradition that had been shaped by the seismic activity of their homeland, the mountains of the Caucasus and eastern Anatolia being among the most earthquake-prone regions in the world. The Armenian builders had learned, through centuries of trial and error, how to construct buildings that could withstand the violent shaking of the earth, a knowledge that was written in the stones of their churches and fortresses, and that was passed from master to apprentice through the generations. The key to Armenian seismic engineering was the use of round or polygonal towers, which distributed the force of a tremor evenly through the structure, the curved surface acting as an arch that transferred the load downward into the foundations without creating the stress concentrations that would crack a square tower. The Armenian churches and monasteries that still stand in the mountains of Cilicia and the Caucasus are a testament to the effectiveness of this seismic engineering, their walls surviving earthquakes that have shattered the buildings of later centuries. The Cathedral of Ani, built in the early 11th century on the banks of the Equirrian River, features a circular drum supporting its dome, the curve of the drum designed to resist the twisting forces of an earthquake. And the drum is pierced by windows that admit light while maintaining the structural integrity of the design. The monastery of Geghard, with its rock-cut chambers and its round towers, is another example of the Armenian mastery of stone construction under seismic stress, its walls clinging to the cliff face and its towers projecting from the rock like natural formations. The Templars, who were responsible for the defense of the Amanus Mountains, the rugged range that separated the Principality of Antioch from Cilicia, had extensive contact with Armenian builders, employing them in the construction of their own castles and observing the performance of Armenian structures during the earthquakes that periodically shook the region. The Templar engineers noted that the round towers of the Armenian fortresses survived tremors that shattered the square towers of the European-style castles, and they incorporated this lesson into their own designs, beginning the transition from square to round that would transform the Templar castle over the course of the 12th century. The round tower, as perfected by the Templars through their collaboration with Armenian masons and their own experimentation, was not merely a cylinder of stone. It was a complex structure designed to serve multiple defensive purposes simultaneously, a self-contained fighting unit that could continue the defense even if the adjacent curtain wall was breached. The tower was built with walls of immense thickness, often exceeding 5 meters at the base, the masonry laid in courses of carefully dressed stone that were bonded with a mortar of exceptional strength, a mortar whose composition was a closely guarded secret of the order. The interior of the tower was divided into multiple levels, each level connected by a spiral stair that curved clockwise, so that a right-handed defender descending the stair would have his sword arm free while the attacker ascending would have his sword arm against the central pillar, a detail that was the product of bitter experience in 100 stairwell fights. Each level of the tower was provided with arrow loops, splayed openings that allowed a crossbowman to cover a wide angle of fire while presenting only a narrow slit to the attacker's return fire. The splay of the loop designed to maximize the field of fire while minimizing the exposure of the shooter. The top of the tower was a fighting platform, crenellated and equipped with machicolations, the projecting stone brackets that allowed the defenders to drop stones and hot liquids directly onto the heads of attackers at the base of the wall, eliminating the blind spot that had plagued the vertical walls of European castles. The round tower was often equipped with its own well and its own store of provisions, so that if the outer wall was lost, the defenders could retreat into the tower and continue the fight, the tower becoming a fortress within a fortress. The placement of the round towers along the curtain wall was a matter of precise mathematical calculation, a science that the Templar engineers had derived from their study of the Byzantine and Armenian models and from their own practical experience of siege warfare. The towers were spaced at intervals that were determined by the effective range of a crossbow, approximately 60 meters, so that the entire length of the curtain wall between two towers could be covered by flanking fire from both directions. An attacker who approached the wall at any point would find himself in the field of fire of at least one, and usually two, of the adjacent towers, and he would be subjected to a crossfire of quarrels that made advance extremely costly, each step forward a gamble with death. The towers were also positioned at the corners of the castle, where they provided enfilading fire along two faces simultaneously, their curved surfaces sweeping the approaches with a continuous curtain of bolts, and at the gates, where they formed the flanks of the Barbican and the gatehouse, their arrow loops sighted along the approaches. The arrangement of the towers was not arbitrary. It was the result of a careful analysis of the terrain, the likely avenues of attack, and the fields of fire that the defenders could bring to bear, an analysis that was conducted by the Grand Master and his council before the first stone was laid. The Templar castle was a structure that had been designed from the inside out, the positions of the towers and the walls determined by the arcs of fire that the crossbowmen could command, and the result was a fortress that had no weaknesses, no gaps in its coverage, and no refuge for the attacker. The transition from square to round towers in Templar architecture can be traced through the archaeological record, which shows a clear evolution over the course of the 12th and 13th centuries, a physical record of the Order's learning process. The earliest Templar castles, such as the first phase of construction at Safed in the 1130s, feature square towers that are virtually indistinguishable from their European counterparts, the builders relying on the familiar forms of their homeland. By the middle of the 12th century, the Templars were beginning to experiment with polygonal towers, which offered some of the advantages of a round tower: the elimination of the vulnerable corners, the distribution of stress, while still retaining the familiar square footprint that the European masons knew how to build. The Castle of Tortosa, rebuilt in the 1160s, features a massive keep that is square at its base but transitions to an octagonal plan at its upper levels, a hybrid design that reflects the transitional nature of Templar architecture in this period, the Order feeling its way toward the round form. By the early 13th century, the round tower had become the standard Templar design, and the great castles that the Order built in the final decades of the Crusader presence, such as Chastel Pellerin and the rebuilt Safed, are dominated by the massive cylinders of their towers, their curved surfaces a signature of the Templar style. This evolution is a mirror of the Templar learning process, a physical record of the Order's ability to absorb new ideas and to apply them to the solution of practical problems, and it is one of the clearest demonstrations of the corporate intelligence that was the hallmark of the Templar approach to warfare. The structural advantages of the round tower extended beyond its resistance to earthquakes and mining to encompass a whole philosophy of construction that emphasized the elimination of weaknesses and the maximization of defensive fire. The curved surface of the tower deflected projectiles, causing a trebuchet stone to skid off rather than to strike with full force, a principle that the Templars understood intuitively and that modern engineering has confirmed through the analysis of the physics of impact. The round plan also eliminated the internal corners of a square tower, the spaces that were difficult to defend and that could become traps if an attacker gained access, the corners providing cover for the enemy and breaking the line of sight of the defenders. A round tower had no internal corners. Its interior was a single, unified space that could be defended in all directions, and the spiral stair that connected the levels was a continuous defensive position that an attacker would have to fight through inch by inch, the clockwise curve of the stair giving the advantage to the defender. The round tower was also stronger against the battering ram, because a ram striking a curved surface would tend to slide off rather than to deliver its full energy to the wall, a simple consequence of geometry that had profound military implications and that the Templars exploited to the full. The Templar preference for round towers was not a matter of aesthetics. It was a matter of survival, and the round towers that still stand in the ruins of their castles are a testament to the soundness of their engineering judgment, a judgment that was validated in the crucible of 100 sieges. The influence of Armenian architecture on the Templars extended beyond the round tower to encompass a whole philosophy of construction that emphasized the adaptation of the building to its site and its climate, a philosophy that was rooted in the Armenian experience of building in the harsh terrain of the Caucasus. The Armenians were masters of the art of building in difficult terrain, erecting fortresses on narrow ridges, steep cliffs, and rocky outcrops that seemed inaccessible to any human approach, their walls seeming to grow out of the rock itself. The Templars adopted this approach, siting their castles on the most challenging terrain available and then adapting the design to the contours of the land, creating fortresses that grew out of the rock like natural formations, their walls following the curves of the cliffs and their towers perched on the highest points. The castle of Chastel Blanc, perched on its conical hill in the Safada Gap, is an example of this kind of siting, its dungeon rising from the summit of the hill in a seamless transition from natural stone to dressed masonry, the line between the man-made and the natural almost invisible. The Templars also adopted the Armenian use of local materials, building their castles from the stone that was quarried on site or nearby, a practice that reduced the logistical burden of construction and ensured that the castle would blend into its surroundings, making it more difficult for an attacker to assess its defenses from a distance. The Templar castle was, in many ways, an Armenian castle built by Frankish warriors, a fusion of two traditions that produced a fortress of unparalleled strength. The historical obscurity of the Armenian contribution to Templar architecture is a consequence of the larger obscurity of the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia, which was conquered by the Mamluks in 1375 and which has been largely forgotten by the Western historical tradition, its achievements overshadowed by the more familiar narratives of the Crusades. The Templar archives, which would have contained the contracts, the plans, and the correspondence that documented the relationship between the order and the Armenian Masons, were destroyed during the suppression of the order in the early 14th century, when the French king and the Pope burned the order's records in an attempt to erase its memory. But the stones themselves are a surviving record, and the archaeologists who have studied the Templar castles have found abundant evidence of Armenian influence in the masonry techniques, the architectural forms, and the decorative motifs of the fortresses. The round towers that were the hallmark of Templar architecture were not a European invention. They were a gift from the ancient Christian people of the Caucasus, adopted and perfected by the warrior monks of the temple, and their presence in the ruins of the Templar castles is a silent testimony to the debt that the order owed to its Armenian allies. The story of the Armenian contribution is a reminder that the Crusader states were not an isolated European outpost but a multicultural society, a fusion of Latin, Greek, Armenian, and Syrian elements that produced a unique and brilliant civilization, and the Templar castles are its most enduring monument. The talus, the sloped, polished stone facing that angled outward from the base of a Templar wall, is perhaps the most visually distinctive and technically brilliant feature of the Order's military architecture, a feature that has no parallel in the castles of Europe and that represents a fundamental rethinking of the relationship between the wall and the projectile. The talus was not a decorative element, an architectural flourish added to please the eye. It was a defensive weapon, a surface that was designed to negate the three greatest threats to a fortress wall: the trebuchet bombardment that could shatter the stoutest masonry, the mining sap that could bring down a tower from below, and the scaling ladder that could deliver attackers directly to the battlements. The principle of the talus was deceptively simple, a principle that the Templars had learned from their observation of Byzantine fortifications and from their own experiments with the behavior of stone under impact. By angling the lower portion of the wall outward at a slope of approximately 60 degrees, the Templar engineers created a surface that would deflect incoming projectiles upward, dissipating their kinetic energy in a shower of stone fragments rather than transmitting it directly into the wall. A trebuchet stone striking a vertical wall would deliver its full force to the point of impact, cracking the masonry and eventually creating a breach, the force of the blow traveling through the wall and causing the stones to shift. The same stone striking a talus would skid upward along the slope, its energy redirected, and it would tumble harmlessly to the base of the wall, leaving the structure undamaged and the attacker staring in frustration at the unbroken barrier. This principle, which modern engineers call the deflection of force, was understood by the Templars through practical experimentation and observation, and they applied it with a systematic rigor that transformed the walls of their castles into virtual mirrors that reflected the fury of the enemy's artillery. The construction of a talus required a degree of masonry skill that was far beyond the capabilities of ordinary builders, a skill that was possessed only by the master masons who had been trained in the Templar workshops, and who had inherited the secrets of the craft from their predecessors. The stones of the talus had to be cut with absolute precision, their outer faces dressed to a smooth, glassy finish that offered no purchase to the grappling hooks of scaling ladders and that minimized the friction that would slow a projectile's deflection, a finish that was achieved by hours of patient work with hammer and chisel. The stones were laid in courses that followed the angle of the slope, each course slightly set back from the course below, creating a series of steps that were then filled and smoothed with a fine mortar to produce a continuous, unbroken surface, a surface that was as smooth as the skin of a ship's hull. The base of the talus extended outward from the wall by a distance of several meters, and its foundation was sunk deep into the bedrock to prevent an attacker from undermining the slope, the foundation itself being a massive block of stone that was keyed into the natural rock. The talus was not a separate structure. It was an integral part of the wall, bonded into the vertical masonry above it, and it was built with the same thickness and strength as the wall itself, so that the talus and the wall formed a single, monolithic structure. The Templar engineers who supervised the construction of the talus were masters of their craft, men who had spent decades learning the secrets of the stone, and their work has survived the centuries with its surface still smooth and its angles still true, a testament to the quality of their construction. The defensive function of the talus against mining operations was as important as its resistance to artillery, and it was a function that had been learned through the bitter experience of watching square towers collapse into the tunnels of the enemy sappers. Mining, the ancient technique of digging a tunnel beneath a wall and then collapsing the tunnel to bring the wall down, was the most feared threat to a medieval fortress, because it bypassed the strength of the walls entirely and attacked the ground beneath them, the one element of the fortress that the defenders could not see or directly defend. A vertical wall rising straight from the ground was an ideal target for mining. The sapper could approach the base of the wall under the cover of a wooden manlet, begin his tunnel at the junction of the wall and the earth, and dig inward until he was beneath the foundations, the work being conducted in secret and the defenders being unaware of the danger until the wall began to crack. The Talus made this approach vastly more difficult, transforming the mining operation from a relatively straightforward engineering task into a near impossible feat of endurance and courage. The sloped surface extended outward from the wall, meaning that the sapper had to begin his tunnel several meters further from the wall, increasing the length of the tunnel and the time required to complete it, time that the defenders could use to countermine or to prepare their defenses. The sapper was also exposed to the fire of the defenders for the entire approach to the wall, because the slope provided no cover, and the smooth surface offered no place to anchor a protective shelter, so that the miners had to work under a continuous rain of crossbow bolts and stones. Once at the base of the talus, the sapper would find that the wall was not vertical but sloped, and that digging beneath a sloped surface was geometrically more difficult than digging beneath a vertical one, the angle of the slope requiring a longer and deeper tunnel to achieve the same undermining effect. The talus was a barrier that forced the miner to work in the open, under the eyes and the crossbows of the garrison, and many a siege was abandoned because the miners could not reach the wall through the withering fire. The talus also served as a defense against the scaling ladder, the simplest and most ancient method of assault, a method that had been used since the walls of Jericho, and that was still a favored tactic of the Muslim armies. A ladder leaned against a vertical wall would rest securely, its top lodged against the parapet, and the attackers could climb it with relative speed, their shields raised against the fire of the defenders. A ladder leaned against the talus would slide downward, its feet slipping on the smooth stone, and the angle of the slope would push the top of the ladder away from the parapet, leaving the climbers dangling in midair and unable to reach the battlements, their legs kicking against the smooth stone as they tried to find a purchase. The Templar defenders, observing the frustration of the attackers as their ladders failed to find purchase, would then drop stones, boiling oil, and Greek fire down the slope, the projectiles sliding along the talus and striking the attackers at the base with multiplied force, the slope acting as a chute that directed the death rain exactly where it would do the most damage. The talus transformed the wall from a passive barrier into an active instrument of destruction, a surface that not only resisted the enemy's assaults but turned the enemy's own momentum against him, the slope that had been built to deflect projectiles now serving to deliver the defenders' counter-fire with deadly accuracy. The psychological impact of the talus on the attackers was profound. They could see the wall ahead of them, but they could not reach it, and every attempt to scale it was met with a rain of death from above, a rain that seemed to come from the wall itself. The Byzantine origins of the talus are well documented in the military manuals of the Eastern Empire, particularly the Strategicon attributed to the Emperor Maurice and the Tactica of Leo the Wise, which described the construction of sloped walls for the fortifications of the Anatolian frontier, a tradition that reached back to the Roman limes of the Danube. The Byzantines had developed the talus in response to the same threats that the Templars faced: the stone-throwing artillery of the Islamic armies and the mining techniques of the Turkish sappers, threats that had been the constant companions of Byzantine military engineers for centuries. The walls of Constantinople, built under the Emperor Theodosius II in the 5th century and repeatedly upgraded over the centuries, featured a talus on the outer face of the main wall, a slope of brick and stone that had withstood countless sieges over 1,000 years, from the Avars and the Persians to the Arabs and the Bulgars. The Templars, who had close diplomatic and military contacts with the Byzantine Empire. Throughout the 12th century, particularly during the reign of Manuel I Comnenos, were able to observe these fortifications firsthand, their emissaries walking the walls of Constantinople and noting the details of their construction. The Grand Masters sent emissaries to the imperial court, and the Byzantine emperors, who regarded the Templars as useful allies against the common Muslim enemy, were willing to share their engineering expertise, providing the order with the knowledge that would transform its castles. The Templar adaptation of the Talus went beyond the Byzantine model in several important respects, improvements that reflected the order's commitment to continuous innovation and its refusal to accept any design as final. The Barbican, that formidable outwork that projected from the gate of a Templar castle like a stone fist clenched against the enemy, was the order's answer to the most vulnerable point of any fortress: the entrance, the one place where the continuous barrier of stone had to be broken to admit the garrison and its supplies. A castle's gate was, by necessity, an opening in the walls, a breach in the otherwise continuous barrier of stone that was the defender's only advantage, and it was the point against which the attacker directed his most determined efforts. In the castles of Europe, the gate was the focus of the attacker's efforts, the point against which the battering ram was directed, the place where the siege tower was rolled, and the path that, once forced, led directly into the interior of the castle, the attacker flooding through the breach and overwhelming the defenders in the courtyard. The Templars, who had seen the gates of their own fortresses stormed by Muslim armies in the early years of the Crusader period, when the order was still learning the art of fortress defense, understood that the gate could not be defended by a simple door and a portcullis. It required a system of layered defenses that would break the momentum of an assault and convert the attacker's numerical superiority into a fatal liability. The Barbican was the outermost layer of this system, a walled enclosure that projected outward from the main gate and that forced the attacker to fight his way through a narrow, twisting passage under the continuous fire of the defenders on three sides, a passage that was deliberately designed to be a death trap. The Barbican was not a separate structure but an integral part of the castle's defensive scheme, a killing box in which every step forward was bought with blood. The architecture of a Templar Barbican was a masterpiece of psychological and physical warfare, designed to disorient, delay, and destroy the attacker, to break his will before it broke his body. The Barbican was entered through a gate that was offset from the main gate, so that an attacker who charged through the outer entrance would find himself facing not the inner gate but a solid wall of stone, his momentum carrying him into the wall with a crash that shattered his shield and his bones. The attacker was forced to turn, usually to the left or right, to continue his advance, and this turn exposed his flank to the fire of the defenders on the walls above. His unshielded side presented to the crossbowmen who had been waiting for this exact moment. The passage through the Barbican was narrow, often no more than 2 meters wide, so that the attackers were forced to advance in a single file, their numbers counting for nothing in the confined space, and it was lined with arrow loops on both sides, so that the attackers were subjected to a continuous crossfire of crossbow bolts that could penetrate shields and armor at close range. The floor of the passage was often uneven, littered with loose stones or deliberately constructed with steps that broke the rhythm of a charge, the attackers stumbling and falling as they tried to run, and the ceiling was pierced by murder holes, openings through which the defenders could pour boiling water, heated sand, or the dreaded Greek fire that clung to flesh and could not be extinguished. The Barbican was a trap, a space that was deliberately designed to be as hostile to human life as possible, and the Templar engineers who constructed these passages poured their dark imaginations into every stone, creating a place that the chroniclers described as the mouth of hell. The murder holes, or meurtrières, that lined the ceiling of the Barbican were a refinement of an ancient defensive technique, but the Templars elevated them to a new level of lethality through the application of systematic engineering and the careful study of the effects of different weapons. In a typical European castle, murder holes were simple openings in the vaulting of the gate passage, through which the defenders could drop stones and pour boiling water, a crude but effective defense that had been used since the Roman period. The Templar murder holes were more sophisticated. They were often channeled through a system of stone gutters that allowed the defenders to pour liquids, oil, water, or the sticky, flaming naphtha of Greek fire, without exposing themselves to the attacker's arrows, the gutters directing the flow of liquid toward the center of the passage. The gutters were sloped to ensure that every corner of the Barbican was covered by the rain of death, and the defenders could pour from multiple holes simultaneously, creating a deluge that no attacker could survive. The Barbican, that formidable outwork that projected from the gate of a Templar castle like a stone fist clenched against the enemy, was the Order's answer to the most vulnerable point of any fortress: the entrance, the one place where the continuous barrier of stone had to be broken to admit the garrison and its supplies. A castle's gate was, by necessity, an opening in the walls, a breach in the otherwise continuous barrier of stone that was the defender's only advantage, and it was the point against which the attacker directed his most determined efforts. In the castles of Europe, the gate was the focus of the attacker's efforts, the point against which the battering ram was directed, the place where the siege tower was rolled, and the path that, once forced, led directly into the interior of the castle, the attacker flooding through the breach and overwhelming the defenders in the courtyard. The Templars, who had seen the gates of their own fortresses stormed by Muslim armies in the early years of the Crusader period, when the Order was still learning the art of fortress defense, understood that the gate could not be defended by a simple door and a portcullis. It required a system of layered defenses that would break the momentum of an assault, and convert the attacker's numerical superiority into a fatal liability. The Barbican was the outermost layer of this system, a walled enclosure that projected outward from the main gate, and that forced the attacker to fight his way through a narrow, twisting passage under the continuous fire of the defenders on three sides, a passage that was deliberately designed to be a death trap. The Barbican was not a separate structure but an integral part of the castle's defensive scheme, a killing box in which every step forward was bought with blood. The architecture of a Templar Barbican was a masterpiece of psychological and physical warfare, designed to disorient, delay, and destroy the attacker, to break his will before it broke his body. The Barbican was entered through a gate that was offset from the main gate, so that an attacker who charged through the outer entrance would find himself facing not the inner gate but a solid wall of stone, his momentum carrying him into the wall with a crash that shattered his shield and his bones. The attacker was forced to turn, usually to the left or right, to continue his advance, and this turn exposed his flank to the fire of the defenders on the walls above, his unshielded side presented to the crossbowmen who had been waiting for this exact moment. The passage through the Barbican was narrow, often no more than 2 meters wide, so that the attackers were forced to advance in a single file, their numbers counting for nothing in the confined space, and it was lined with arrow loops on both sides, so that the attackers were subjected to a continuous crossfire of crossbow bolts that could penetrate shields and armor at close range. The floor of the passage was often uneven, littered with loose stones or deliberately constructed with steps that broke the rhythm of a charge, the attackers stumbling and falling as they tried to run, and the ceiling was pierced by murder holes, openings through which the defenders could pour boiling water, heated sand, or the dreaded Greek fire that clung to flesh and could not be extinguished. The Barbican was a trap, a space that was deliberately designed to be as hostile to human life as possible, and the Templar engineers who constructed these passages poured their dark imaginations into every stone, creating a place that the chroniclers described as the mouth of hell. The murder holes, or meurtrières, that lined the ceiling of the Barbican were a refinement of an ancient defensive technique, but the Templars elevated them to a new level of lethality through the application of systematic engineering and the careful study of the effects of different weapons. In a typical European castle, murder holes were simple openings in the vaulting of the gate passage, through which the defenders could drop stones and pour boiling water, a crude but effective defense that had been used since the Roman period. The Templar murder holes were more sophisticated. They were often channeled through a system of stone gutters that allowed the defenders to pour liquids, oil, water, or the sticky, flaming naphtha of Greek fire, without exposing themselves to the attacker's arrows, the gutters directing the flow of liquid toward the center of the passage. The gutters were sloped to ensure that every corner of the Barbican was covered by the rain of death, and the defenders could pour from multiple holes simultaneously, creating a deluge that no attacker could survive. The Templars also positioned the murder holes at regular intervals along the passage, so that an attacker who survived the first deluge would immediately face a second, and a third, the psychological effect of the continuous assault breaking the will of even the bravest soldiers, who could see their comrades dying ahead of them, and knew that the same fate awaited them. The Barbican was not merely a defensive work, it was a machine for the industrial-scale slaughter of the enemy, and the murder holes were its nozzles, pouring death from above in a continuous, unstoppable stream. The gate of the Barbican was itself a formidable obstacle, a massive structure of iron-bound oak that could withstand the blows of a battering ram for hours, its timbers reinforced with iron bands and its surface studded with iron nails that were designed to break the teeth of a ram. The portcullis, the heavy iron grating that was lowered through grooves in the masonry, was the first line of defense, its sharpened spikes capable of impaling any attacker caught beneath it as it fell, the spikes driving through armor and flesh with a sound that was the last thing many a soldier heard. The Templar portcullises were operated by a system of winches and counterweights located in the gatehouse above, a mechanism that allowed a single sergeant to raise or lower the grating in seconds, the winch being fitted with a ratchet and pawl that prevented the portcullis from being forced up from below. The grooves in which the portcullis ran were cut into the solid stone of the gatehouse walls, and they were protected from attack by the crossbowmen on the flanking towers, so that an attacker who tried to jam the portcullis with a beam would be shot down before he could reach the groove. Behind the portcullis, the inner doors of the Barbican were a second barrier, their iron hinges and massive locks designed to resist the battering ram even if the portcullis was forced, the doors being backed by a series of bars that were operated from within the gatehouse. The Templar gate was a succession of obstacles, each of which had to be overcome in turn, and the time required to force each obstacle was time that the defenders used to mass their forces and to prepare the inner defenses for the assault. The flanking towers that rose on either side of the Barbican were the key to the system, providing the enfilading fire that made the passage a death trap, their arrow loops sighted along the approach and their matriculations projecting over the entrance. These towers were round, eliminating the blind spots that would have allowed an attacker to shelter at their base, and their arrow loops were positioned at multiple levels, so that the crossbowmen on the upper stories could fire down into the Barbican while their brothers on the lower levels fired horizontally into the flanks of the attackers, creating a three-dimensional field of fire that no shield could block. The towers were connected to the Barbican by a series of internal passages, allowing the defenders to move between the tower and the gatehouse without exposing themselves to the fire of the enemy, the passages being protected by their own portcullises and murder holes. The Templar Barbican was a three-dimensional field of fire, with attackers exposed to fire from above, from the sides, and even from below, where postern gates might allow a sally of knights to emerge into the rear of the assaulting column, the knights charging out to slaughter the attackers from behind. The Barbican was the most dangerous place on any battlefield in the 12th century, and the Templars, who had designed it to be so, were the undisputed masters of its use, their Barbicans holding against assaults that had shattered the gates of lesser fortresses. The integration of the Barbican into the concentric plan of the castle was a further refinement that the Templars pioneered, a refinement that turned the entire castle into a series of Barbicans, each gate a new layer of the trap. In a concentric castle, the outer wall was itself a kind of Barbican for the inner ward, and the gate of the outer wall was protected by a Barbican of its own, so that the attacker had to fight his way through a Barbican, into the space between the walls, and then through another Barbican to reach the inner ward. An attacker who fought his way through the outer Barbican and into the space between the walls found himself in a second killing zone, exposed to fire from the inner wall and from the towers that flanked the gap, a space that was as dangerous as the Barbican he had just left. The inner gate, offset from the outer gate, required the attacker to turn again, exposing his flank once more, and the inner Barbican, if present, repeated the horrors of the outer one, the same murder holes, the same crossfire, the same death trap. The Templar concentric castle was a succession of traps, each designed to strip away the enemy's advantage of numbers and to reduce the attacking force to a bloody remnant by the time it reached the heart of the fortress, and the Barbican was the first and most important of these traps, the gate that was not a gate, but a grave. The psychological impact of the Barbican on the attackers is well attested in the chronicles of the Crusader period, the chroniclers recording the terror that the Barbican inspired in the hearts of the bravest soldiers. The Muslim historian Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad, describing a failed assault on a Templar castle, writes that the attackers entered the gate of the Franks as if entering the mouth of hell, and they emerged as the dead emerge from their graves, fewer and broken. A vivid image that captures the horror of the experience. The sound of the portcullis crashing down behind them, the sight of the solid wall ahead of them, and the continuous rain of bolts and stones from above were enough to break the morale of even the most determined soldiers, who could see that they were trapped and that there was no way out. The Barbican was a weapon of terror as well as of steel, and its psychological effect was multiplied by the reputation that the Templar castles had earned over decades of successful defense, a reputation that was known throughout the Muslim world. An army that approached a Templar gate knew that it was approaching the most dangerous ground in the Holy Land, and the knowledge itself was a defense, sapping the courage of the attackers before the first bolt was fired, the fear of the Barbican doing the work of 1,000 crossbowmen. The evolution of the Templar Barbican can be traced through the archaeological record, from the simple gate towers of the early castles to the complex, multi-layered Barbicans of the 13th century fortresses, a physical record of the order's learning process. The castle of Chastelet, built in 1178 and destroyed by Saladin in 1179, had a barbican that was still under construction at the time of the siege, and its remains show the basic elements of the design: an offset gate, flanking towers, and the beginnings of a murder hole system, a design that was incomplete but that showed the direction of Templar thinking. The castle of Chastel-Pellerin, built 40 years later, had a barbican of extraordinary complexity, with a double gate, multiple portcullises, and a labyrinthine passage that twisted through the outer defenses, a barbican that was never forced in the history of the castle. The Templar Barbican was not a static design, it was a continuously evolving response to the changing tactics of the Muslim armies, and its development is a mirror of the Order's commitment to innovation in every aspect of military engineering, a commitment that was driven by the knowledge that the safety of the Holy Land depended on the strength of its gates. The training of the gate garrison was as important as the design of the gate itself, and the Templar rules specified the duties of every brother who was assigned to gate duty, a set of procedures that had been refined over decades of experience. The watch commander was responsible for maintaining the readiness of the gate, inspecting the portcullises and the doors daily, and ensuring that the murder holes were supplied with stones, water, and oil, the supplies being replenished after every action. The crossbowmen on the gate towers were required to know the fields of fire by heart, and they practiced their aim against targets that had been placed at the known distances along the approach road, their bolts striking the targets with a precision that was the product of constant practice. The gate garrison was drilled in the procedures for repelling an assault, including the signals that would summon reinforcements from the inner ward and the commands that would trigger the release of the portcullis and the opening of the murder holes, the entire garrison acting as a single, coordinated machine. The Templar Gate was a system that relied on the coordinated actions of dozens of men, and the discipline of the garrison was the final component that made the system work, the human element that turned the stone trap into a living, killing thing. The concentric castle, the supreme achievement of medieval military architecture, was a design that the Templars did not invent but that they brought to a level of perfection that surpassed any other fortress of the age, a perfection that was the result of decades of trial and error in the crucible of the Holy Land. The basic idea of concentricity, an inner ward protected by an outer wall, creating a layered defense, had been present in rudimentary form in the Roman castra that had been built along the frontiers of the empire, and in the Byzantine fortresses of the Anatolian frontier that had held the line against the Arabs and the Turks. But it was the Templars, working in the desperate conditions of the Crusader states, who transformed the concentric plan into a science, calculating the heights, the distances, and the angles with a precision that allowed a small garrison to hold a vast area against an army that outnumbered it 10-1. The concentric castle was the physical embodiment of the Templar principle of force multiplication, a structure that turned every breach into a trap and every assault into a massacre, its walls and towers working together as a single, integrated weapon. The concentric design was not merely a matter of building two walls instead of one. It was a complete rethinking of the castle's geometry, a transformation of the fortress from a passive shell that could be broken into an active instrument of death that struck back at every attempt. The key to the concentric design was the height differential between the outer and inner walls, a differential that was calculated with mathematical precision to maximize the defensive fire of the garrison. The inner wall was always higher than the outer wall, so that the defenders on the inner wall could fire over the heads of the defenders on the outer wall, their crossbows commanding the entire outer ward and the approaches beyond, and so that the inner wall could provide covering fire for the outer wall if the outer wall was breached. This height differential meant that an attacker who captured the outer wall found himself in a space that was dominated by the inner wall, a space where every movement was visible to the defenders on the higher parapet, and where there was no shelter from their fire, the inner wall looming above him like a cliff. The outer wall was essentially a forward defensive position, a barrier that was designed to delay and damage the attacker, to make him pay for every meter of ground, and its loss was not fatal because the inner wall remained intact and the defenders could retreat to it in good order, the concentric plan providing a depth of defense that the simple castles of Europe lacked. The concentric castle was a system of defense in depth, a series of positions that could be abandoned in turn without the castle itself falling, and this depth was the key to its resilience, the secret of its ability to withstand sieges that lasted for months or years. The space between the walls, the outer ward of the concentric plan, was a carefully designed killing ground, a space that was intended to be the grave of any attacker who succeeded in breaching the outer defenses. The distance between the outer and inner walls was calculated to be within the effective range of the crossbows on the inner wall, so that an attacker who entered the space was immediately under fire, his every step tracked by the crossbowmen on the higher parapet, and there was no place to hide. The ground between the walls was often leveled and cleared of any cover, the buildings that might have provided shelter being deliberately omitted from the design, so that the attacker was forced to cross an open field under the fire of the defenders, a field that was as bare as a parade ground. The surface was sometimes paved with loose stones that made running difficult and that amplified the sound of the attacker's approach, giving the defenders audible warning of the assault, the stones clattering under the feet of the advancing soldiers and alerting the garrison to their presence. The inner wall was provided with towers at regular intervals, projecting into the space between the walls and providing enfilading fire along the entire length of the gap, the crossbow bolts sweeping the outer ward from both flanks. The attacker who broke into the space between the walls found himself in a shooting gallery, and the only way out was to assault the inner gate, which was itself a fortress within a fortress, or to retreat through the breach by which he had entered, a retreat that was often blocked by the press of his own advancing troops, the soldiers behind pushing forward while those in front tried to flee. The concentric plan also allowed the Templars to organize their defense in a way that maximized the effectiveness of their limited manpower, a consideration that was crucial in the Holy Land, where the Frankish population was always a fraction of the enemy's. The garrison could be concentrated on the inner wall, where they were protected by the outer wall from direct assault, the outer wall serving as a shield that absorbed the first shock of the attack, and the outer wall was manned by a smaller force that could be reinforced or withdrawn as the situation demanded. If the outer wall was breached, the defenders on the outer wall could retreat through postern gates into the space between the walls, and then through the inner gate into the inner ward, where they could continue the fight, their retreat covered by the fire of the inner wall. The attacker, having fought his way through the outer wall, would find the inner wall as formidable as the outer wall had been, and the defenders, now concentrated on a smaller perimeter, would be more densely positioned and harder to overwhelm, their crossbows creating a denser curtain of fire. The concentric castle was a flexible defense, capable of adapting to the flow of the battle, and its design ensured that the attacker would pay a maximum price for every meter of ground, a price that most attackers were unwilling to pay. The Templar castle of Chastel-Pellerin, built on the coastal promontory south of Haifa, was one of the earliest and most perfect examples of the concentric plan, a fortress that incorporated every lesson that the Order had learned over a century of fortress construction. The outer wall, which followed the curve of the promontory, was protected by a massive talus that rose from the sea, its surface polished to a glassy smoothness that deflected the stones of the Mamluk trebuchets, the stones skidding off and splashing into the water. The battlements were lined with round towers that provided flanking fire along the entire length of the curtain, their arrow loops sighted along the approaches and their machicolations projecting over the base of the wall. The inner wall, higher and thicker than the outer wall, was built on the highest point of the promontory, and its towers commanded a view of the entire outer ward and the approaches from the sea, the crossbowmen on the inner wall able to fire down onto any attacker who entered the outer ward. The space between the walls was a flat, open area that was completely exposed to the fire of the inner wall, and the gate of the inner ward was offset from the gate of the outer ward, forcing an attacker to traverse the entire length of the killing ground under continuous fire, his flank exposed to the towers on the inner wall. The concentric design of Chastel Pellerin was so effective that the castle was never taken by storm, and its garrison of a few hundred knights and sergeants held it against the entire Mamluk army during the final years of the Crusader presence, a testament to the soundness of the concentric plan. The concentric castle of Safed, rebuilt in the 1240s after its recovery from the Ayyubids, was an even larger and more sophisticated application of the same principles, a fortress that was designed to be the linchpin of the entire Templar defensive system in the Galilee. The outer wall of Safed, with its 7 massive round towers, enclosed a vast area on the flattened summit of the volcanic cone, an area that was large enough to contain the entire garrison and its supplies for a year. The inner wall, with its massive keep and its deep well, rose from the center of the enclosure, its height commanding the outer ward and the surrounding countryside. The space between the walls was wide, creating a killing ground of such size that an attacker who breached the outer wall would have to cross 100 meters of open ground under the fire of the inner wall's crossbowmen, and the enfilading fire of the towers, 100 meters of continuous death. The concentric plan of Safed was designed to hold a garrison of 2,000 men for a year, and its design was the culmination of a century of Templar experimentation with the concentric form, the final expression of the Order's architectural philosophy. The fall of Safed in 1266, after a siege of 40 days and the betrayal of the garrison by Baibars, was not a failure of the concentric design but a failure of the political and demographic foundations of the Crusader states, a failure that no architecture could have prevented. The influence of the Templar concentric castles on the military architecture of Europe was profound and long-lasting, a legacy that outlasted the Order itself and that shaped the fortresses of the late medieval period. The great concentric castles of Edward I in Wales, built in the late 13th century to cement the English conquest, were directly inspired by the Templar and Hospitaller fortresses of the Holy Land, their designs brought back to Europe by Crusaders who had seen the castles with their own eyes. The master mason James of St. George, who designed Beaumaris, Harlech, and Rhuddlan, had almost certainly studied the plans of the Crusader castles, and his work in Wales is a translation of the Eastern concentric design into the damp, green landscape of Britain, the same principles of concentricity, enfilading fire, and defense in depth applied to a new context. The concentric plan became the standard model for the castles of the late Middle Ages, and its principles were incorporated into the bastion fortifications of the early modern period, the star-shaped fortresses that were the response to gunpowder artillery. The Templar concentric castle, born in the desperate struggle for the Holy Land, became a permanent part of the military heritage of the West, a gift that the warrior monks gave to the civilization they had sworn to defend. The elimination of blind spots, which was the guiding principle of the concentric plan, was achieved through the precise alignment of the towers, the walls, and the arrow loops, a geometry that was as rigorous as any mathematical proof and that was laid out on the ground with ropes and stakes before the first stone was cut. The Templar engineers, working with the tools of the compass, the square, and the plumb line, laid out their castles with an attention to angles and lines of sight that would not be matched until the age of the theodolite, the surveyor's instrument that would revolutionize fortress design in the 16th century. Every tower was placed so that its field of fire covered the entire length of the adjacent curtain wall, and every arrow loop was splayed to maximize the angle of fire while minimizing the exposure of the crossbowmen, the loop being wider on the inside than on the outside. The result was a fortress that had no hidden corners, no sheltered spaces where an attacker could pause and regroup, a fortress that was an unblinking eye of stone that denied the enemy any refuge. The Templar castle was a structure that seemed to see in all directions, and its garrison, fighting from behind its unblinking walls, could bring the full force of their weapons to bear on every square meter of the approach, a force that was multiplied by the precision of the design. The concentric castle was also a reflection of the Templar understanding of the psychological dimension of defense, a dimension that was as important as the physical dimension and that the Order exploited to the full. The site of a concentric fortress, with its multiple lines of walls rising in terraces from the plain, was intended to intimidate the attacker before the battle had even begun, to plant the seed of doubt that would grow into despair as the siege dragged on. The concentric castle was a statement. Beyond this wall there is another, and behind that another, and the cost of taking this fortress will be your army, a cost that no sultan could afford to pay. The Muslim commanders who contemplated the siege of a Templar concentric castle knew that they were committing their men to a battle of attrition that could last for months, and the knowledge itself was a deterrent, a weapon that worked on the mind of the enemy. The concentric castle was a weapon of the mind as well as of the stone, and the Templars, who understood the psychology of their enemies through decades of warfare, used it to full effect, the walls themselves serving as a silent argument for the futility of the assault. The enfilading fire that swept the approaches to a Templar castle was not the product of chance or of the individual initiative of the crossbowmen. It was the result of a deliberate and systematic design philosophy that sought to cover every angle of approach with a crossfire of quarrels, arrows, and stones, a philosophy that was as rigorous as any modern fire plan. Enfilade, a term borrowed from the later vocabulary of gunpowder warfare, describes fire that comes from the flank, striking the attacker in the side where his shield offers no protection, and the Templars, centuries before the term was coined, had mastered the principle of enfilade through the careful placement of their towers, the curvature of their walls, and the positioning of their arrow loops. An attacker who advanced on a Templar castle was never able to face the defenders directly. He was always exposed to fire from the side, a constant, gnawing threat that forced him to divide his attention and that made every step forward a gamble with death, the crossbow bolts hissing in from his left and his right simultaneously. The enfilading fire was the key to the Templar system of defense, the element that turned the castle from a passive barrier into an active instrument of slaughter, and its effectiveness was the result of a deliberate design process that had been refined over decades of experience. The round towers that the Templars placed at intervals along their curtain walls were the primary instruments of enfilading fire, their curved surfaces projecting outward from the wall and providing platforms from which crossbowmen could fire along the face of the curtain in both directions. A round tower, with its continuous curved surface, had no corners to create blind spots, and an attacker who approached the wall at any point between two round towers found himself in the overlapping fields of fire of both towers, a crossfire that was devastating in its intensity. The crossbow bolts came from the left and the right simultaneously, and the attacker's shield, which could protect him from one direction, was useless against the other, the bolts striking him in the side where his armor was thinnest. The Templar round towers were spaced at intervals of approximately 60 meters, a distance that was calculated to ensure that the entire length of the curtain wall was covered by enfilading fire from both flanks, the fields of fire overlapping at the midpoint between the towers. The towers themselves were provided with multiple levels of arrow loops, so that the fire came from different heights and angles, making it impossible for the attacker to find shelter by crouching or by holding his shield at a particular angle. The enfilading fire from the round towers was a continuous, multi-directional assault that wore down the attacker's morale as well as their bodies. The arrow loops, or embrasures, through which the crossbowmen fired were not simple slits in the wall, cut by a mason who had no understanding of their function. They were carefully engineered openings designed to maximize the field of fire while minimizing the exposure of the shooter, a balance that had been achieved through generations of experimentation. The typical Templar arrow loop was splayed on the interior, so that the crossbowman could pivot his weapon through a wide arc while the external opening remained a narrow slit, barely visible to the attacker and almost impossible to hit with a return shot. The loop was often fitted with a wooden shutter that could be closed when the crossbowman was reloading, protecting him from the arrows that might come through the slit, and the sill of the loop was sloped downward to allow the shooter to aim at the base of the wall, eliminating the blind spot at the foot of the curtain. Some arrow loops were designed as cross loops, a cruciform opening that allowed the crossbowman to fire in a wider vertical and horizontal arc, a design that the Templars may have adapted from the Byzantine and Armenian fortresses they had studied, and that was particularly effective against moving targets. The arrow loop was the Templar crossbowman's window onto the battlefield, and its design was the product of generations of refinement, each modification aimed at increasing the lethality of the shot, the crossbowman's bolt passing through the slit and striking the attacker with the force of a thunderbolt. The machicolations that projected from the parapets of the Templar walls were another component of the enfilading system, providing a vertical dimension to the defensive fire that completed the three-dimensional field of death. A matriculation was a stone bracket that supported a projecting platform, and the gaps between the brackets, known as meurtrières or murder holes, allowed the defenders to drop stones, pour boiling liquids, or fire crossbows directly downward onto the heads of attackers at the base of the wall. The matriculations were positioned above the gates, where the attackers were most concentrated, above the corners of the towers, where the attackers might try to shelter, and at regular intervals along the curtain wall, ensuring that there was no place at the base of the wall where an attacker could pause and prepare his next move. The matriculation was the answer to the problem of the dead zone at the foot of a vertical wall, a zone that European castles had been unable to defend and that had been the site of countless successful escalades, and its use by the Templars was a key factor in the elimination of blind spots from their fortresses. The combination of the enfilading fire from the towers, the horizontal fire from the arrow loops, and the vertical fire from the matriculations created a three-dimensional web of death that covered every square meter of the approach. The integration of the various elements of the defensive system, the round towers, the arrow loops, the matriculations, and the concentric walls, into a single, coherent field of fire was the highest achievement of Templar military engineering, a synthesis that transformed the castle into a single, integrated weapon. The Templar castle was designed as a single, integrated weapon, a structure in which every element supported every other element, the towers providing enfilading fire, the arrow loops providing horizontal fire, the matriculations providing vertical fire, and the concentric walls providing depth. The result was a fortress that had no weaknesses, no gaps in its coverage, and no refuge for the attacker, a fortress that killed with the efficiency of a machine, and the machine was designed by men who had made the study of death their life's work. The Templar engineers, who had learned their trade in the sieges of the Holy Land, understood that a fortress was not a collection of walls and towers but a system, a network of mutually supporting positions that work together to achieve a single purpose: the destruction of the enemy. The enfilading fire was the heart of this system, the element that made the Templar castle the most formidable defensive work of the medieval world. The effectiveness of the Templar enfilading system in actual combat is attested by the accounts of the survivors, both Frankish and Muslim, who recorded their experiences in chronicles that have survived the centuries. The chronicler Jean de Gennevilliers, who fought alongside the Templars during the Seventh Crusade and who knew the Order's castles firsthand, describes the fire from a Templar castle as a rain of death that fell from every direction, so that a man could not lift his head without receiving a bolt through the eye. An image that captures the density and the accuracy of the fire. The Muslim chronicler Imad ad-Din al-Isfahani, describing a failed assault on a Templar fortress, writes that the Franks had placed their towers so that every step of our advance was flanked by their fire, and our soldiers fell as wheat falls before the scythe. A metaphor that evokes the harvest of death that the enfilading fire reaped. These accounts confirm that the Templar system worked as intended, that the enfilading fire was a decisive factor in the defense of the castles, and that the engineering principles that had been applied to the design of the fortresses had been validated in the most brutal test of all, the test of battle, where the theories of the architects met the realities of steel and flesh. The legacy of the Templar enfilading system can be seen in the fortifications of the early modern period, when the introduction of gunpowder artillery forced a new revolution in fortress design, a revolution that built on the principles that the Templars had developed. The Tres Italiens, the star-shaped fortress with its projecting bastions, was developed in the 15th and 16th centuries to provide enfilading fire for cannon, and its principles were directly descended from the round towers and flanking fire of the Templar castles. The bastion, like the Templar round tower, projected outward from the curtain wall and allowed the defenders to fire along the face of the wall from the flanks, the bastion's angled faces designed to provide the same kind of enfilading fire that the round towers had provided for crossbows. The architects of the Tres Italiens, men like Francesco di Giorgio Martini and Sebastian Leprestre de Vauban, were the inheritors of the Templar tradition, though they may not have known the source of the principles they applied. The Templar enfilading system, born in the desperate struggle for the Holy Land, became a permanent part of the art of fortification, a legacy that is still visible in the fortresses that guard the borders of modern nations. The training of the crossbowmen who manned the arrow loops of a Templar castle was as rigorous as the design of the loops themselves, for a well-designed weapon is useless without a skilled operator. The Templar rule required every sergeant to practice with the crossbow for a specified number of hours each week, and the castles were equipped with ranges where the brothers could hone their skills against straw targets and moving dummies, the ranges being laid out to simulate the approaches to the castle. The crossbow was the Templar weapon of choice for garrison defense, its powerful draw capable of piercing armor at up to 300 meters, and its mechanical reloading mechanism allowing a steady rate of fire that could be sustained for hours. The crossbowmen were trained to fire in volleys, concentrating their shots on the lead elements of an advancing column, and they were taught to aim for the gaps in the armor, the visor slits, the armpits, the groin, rather than relying on the power of the bolt alone to penetrate the plate. The Templar crossbowman was a professional, his skill the product of years of practice, and his accuracy was a crucial component of the castle's defensive system, the human element that turned the stone geometry into a living defense. The construction of a Templar castle was an engineering project of immense complexity that began not with the laying of the first stone but with the selection of the site, a process that could take months and that involved the careful analysis of every aspect of the terrain, the climate, and the strategic situation. The Grand Master, accompanied by the Marshal, the Draper, and a team of engineers and local guides, would ride the circuit of the proposed site, examining the approaches from every direction, testing the soil with iron probes to determine the depth of the bedrock, and consulting with the local inhabitants about the patterns of rainfall, the location of springs, and the history of seismic activity in the region. The site had to meet a rigorous set of criteria that had been developed over decades of experience, and that were applied with the same discipline as the rule itself. It had to be on high ground, to provide visibility, and to deny the advantage of height to the attacker, the defenders looking down on the enemy rather than the enemy looking down on them. It had to have a reliable water source, either a spring or an aquifer that could be reached by a well, because a castle without water was a death trap that would fall within days. It had to be defensible on at least one side by a natural feature, such as a cliff or a river, so that the defenders could concentrate their efforts on the remaining approaches. And it had to be positioned to control a strategic route, a pass, a ford, or a road, so that the castle would serve not merely as a refuge, but as an active instrument of territorial control. The selection of the site was the most important decision in the entire construction process, because a castle built in the wrong place was a castle that would fall, no matter how thick its walls. Once the site was chosen, the Templar engineers began the work of surveying and planning, laying out the ground plan of the castle with a precision that still astonishes modern archaeologists, who have found that the alignments of the walls are often accurate to within a few centimeters over distances of hundreds of meters. The surveyors used a combination of ropes, stakes, and plumb lines to mark the lines of the walls, the positions of the towers, and the locations of the gates, and they used a water level, a primitive but effective instrument that used the surface of standing water to establish a horizontal reference, to ensure that the foundations were level across the entire site. The plan of the castle was drawn on parchment, a working drawing that was used to guide the construction and that was updated as the work progressed, the drawing being a precious document that was guarded in the Templar archives. The Templar archives, which were lost when the order was suppressed in the early 14th century, almost certainly contained hundreds of these plans, the accumulated wisdom of a century of fortress construction, but only fragments have survived, preserved in the archives of other orders or in the archaeological record, where the footings of the walls reveal the original layout. The planning phase was a collaboration between the military officers, who understood the tactical requirements of the castle, the fields of fire, the siting of the gates, the layout of the killing grounds, and the master masons, who understood the capabilities and limitations of the materials and the site, the two groups working together to translate the strategic vision into a practical design. The quarrying of the stone for a Templar castle was a massive logistical operation that employed hundreds of laborers, including local peasants who were paid for their work, captured Muslim prisoners who were put to labor as a condition of their captivity, and skilled stonemasons from the workshops of Europe and the Levant who were lured to the Holy Land by the promise of generous pay and the spiritual benefits of contributing to the defense of the holy places. The stone was quarried as close to the construction site as possible, often from the very hill on which the castle was to be built, so that the quarry itself became a part of the castle's defenses, its excavated face forming a sheer cliff that added to the natural defenses of the site, and that provided the stone for the walls. The stone was cut from the living rock using iron wedges and sledgehammers, the wedges driven into natural fissures or into slots cut with a pick, and the blocks were then roughly dressed by the quarrymen before being transported to the building site on ox-drawn sleds or on the backs of mules, the animals laboring up the slopes with their heavy loads. The size of the blocks was a compromise between the desire for massive stones that would be difficult to dislodge and the practical limitations of the lifting equipment, and the largest blocks, some weighing several tons, were used in the foundations and the talus, where their weight added to the stability of the structure and their mass defied the efforts of the sappers. The transportation of the stone from the quarry to the building site was the most labor-intensive phase of the construction, and the Templar engineers developed a variety of techniques to move the massive blocks, techniques that had been used since the construction of the pyramids, and that the Templars adapted to the specific conditions of their sites. On level ground, the stones were loaded onto wooden sleds and dragged by teams of oxen, the runners of the sleds greased with animal fat to reduce friction, the oxen straining against their yokes. On steep slopes, the stones were lowered on ropes, the ropes wrapped around posts to control the descent, or they were rolled on a bed of logs, a technique that reduced the friction and allowed a single team of oxen to move a stone that would otherwise have required a dozen. The Templars also made use of the sea, transporting stone by ship from coastal quarries to the site of coastal castles such as Pellerin, a practice that was faster and less labor-intensive than land transport, and that allowed the use of stone that was not available locally. The logistical network that supported the construction of a Templar castle was a triumph of medieval engineering, a system of roads, ramps, and lifting devices that moved thousands of tons of stone with an efficiency that would not be matched until the Industrial Revolution. The lifting of the stones into place was accomplished by a variety of cranes and hoists, the most common of which was the treadwheel crane, a massive wooden wheel that was turned by men walking inside it, their weight providing the power to lift the stones. The treadwheel crane, which had been used in Europe since the Roman period and which was a common sight on the construction sites of the great cathedrals, was capable of lifting stones weighing several tons to a height of over 30 meters, and the Templars installed these cranes at strategic points around the construction site, their wooden frames rising above the rising walls like the skeletons of some monstrous bird. The stones were lifted by a system of ropes and pulleys, the ropes guided by a master rigger who directed the crew with hand signals and shouted commands, the entire operation requiring a coordination that was the product of long practice. The stones were set in place by the masons, who used iron levers and wooden wedges to adjust the fit, the masons working with a precision that ensured that the joints between the blocks were almost invisible. The mortar that bonded the stones together was a closely guarded secret, a mixture of lime, sand, and volcanic ash that was designed to harden to a stone-like consistency and to resist the penetration of water and the growth of vegetation that could crack the masonry. The Templar mortar was often reinforced with the addition of animal hair or chopped straw, which acted as a binding agent and increased the tensile strength of the joint, a technique that had been learned from the Byzantine masons. The speed of construction was a critical factor in the success of a Templar castle, because a fortress that was not completed within a single building season was vulnerable to a preemptive attack by the enemy, a lesson that the Templars had learned at the catastrophic loss of Chastelet in 1179, when the unfinished castle was stormed by Saladin after just 5 days of siege. The Templars, who never forgot the lesson of Chastelet, developed techniques to accelerate the construction without sacrificing quality, techniques that were the product of careful planning and the efficient organization of labor. The work was organized in shifts, with the laborers working from dawn to dusk, and in some cases through the night by the light of torches and bonfires, the night shifts allowing the work to continue around the clock. The walls were built in sections, with multiple teams working simultaneously at different points along the circuit, each team responsible for a section of the wall that was keyed into the sections on either side. The stone was stockpiled in advance so that the masons would never be idle waiting for material, the quarrymen working ahead of the masons to ensure a continuous supply. The construction of a major Templar castle, such as the rebuilding of Safed in the 1240s, could be completed in less than 3 years, a remarkable speed for a fortress of its size and complexity, and the result was a structure that was defensible within weeks of the foundation being laid, the outer walls being the first to be raised so that they could provide protection for the later stages of the work. The finishing of the castle, once the main walls were raised, was a process that could take as long as the construction itself, for it was in the finishing that the defensive refinements were added, the details that turned the fortress from a shell into a fighting machine. The talus was dressed to its final smoothness, the masons working with fine chisels and abrasives to achieve the glassy surface that would deflect projectiles. The arrow loops were cut and splayed, their angles carefully checked against the fields of fire that had been laid out in the planning stage. The machicolations were installed, their brackets projecting from the parapets, and the gates were hung, their massive timbers swinging on iron hinges that had been forged in the Templar workshops. The interior of the castle was fitted out with the living quarters, the chapel, the armory, and the stores that would sustain the garrison, and the water system was tested and commissioned, the cisterns filled with water and the pipes checked for leaks. The construction of a Templar castle was not complete until every stone was in place, every arrow loop was functional, and every crossbowman knew his station, the entire fortress being tested in a series of mock assaults before it was declared ready for war. The Templar approach to construction was holistic, encompassing every aspect of the castle's function from the foundation to the battlements, and the result was a fortress that was not merely built but engineered, a machine of stone that was as close to perfection as the medieval world could achieve. The water supply of a Templar castle was a matter of life and death, a strategic resource that was as important as the thickness of the walls or the sharpness of the swords, and the order devoted a prodigious amount of engineering effort to ensuring that its garrisons would never die of thirst. The location of a castle was chosen, first and foremost, for the presence of a reliable water source, a spring that emerged from the rock, an aquifer that could be reached by a well, or a catchment area that could fill the cisterns during the winter rains that swept across the Holy Land from November to March. The Templar engineers, who had studied the hydraulic works of the Romans and the Byzantines, the aqueducts and the cisterns that still dotted the landscape of the Levant, developed a sophisticated system of water management that collected, stored, and distributed every drop of available moisture, turning their castles into oases that could withstand a siege of indefinite duration. The water system of a Templar castle was a hidden marvel, a network of channels, cisterns, and pipes that was buried beneath the masonry and that is only now being fully appreciated through archaeological investigation, the excavators revealing the scale and the sophistication of the Templar hydrological engineering. The cistern was the heart of the Templar water system, a vast underground reservoir that was carved into the bedrock beneath the castle and lined with a waterproof cement of the highest quality, a cement that was a closely guarded secret of the order. The Templar cisterns were often enormous, capable of holding millions of liters of water, their vaulted ceilings supported by pillars of stone, the whole structure being a subterranean cathedral of water. They were fed by a system of channels that collected rainwater from every roof, courtyard, and paved surface within the castle, the water being directed into the cisterns by a network of gutters and downspouts that were integrated into the architecture of the fortress. The water was filtered as it entered the cistern, passing through a series of settling chambers where the sediment and debris were allowed to sink to the bottom, the clear water being drawn from the top of the cistern while the sediment accumulated below. The cistern itself was divided into multiple compartments, so that if one compartment was contaminated by a dead animal, or by a malicious act of the enemy, the others remained pure and the garrison could continue to draw water. The cistern was ventilated by shafts that rose to the surface, allowing the water to breathe and preventing the buildup of the gases that could make the water foul, and the shafts were capped with stone grills that prevented an attacker from poisoning the water by dropping dead animals or foul matter into the cistern. The Templar cistern was a masterpiece of sanitary engineering, a reservoir that could sustain a garrison for years if necessary, and its construction was one of the first tasks undertaken on any new castle site. The well was the alternative to the cistern in castles where the bedrock was deep enough to reach an aquifer, and the Templars were willing to undertake extraordinary labors to sink a well to the water table, labors that could take years and that cost the lives of many diggers. The Well of Safety, sunk through over 100 meters of solid basalt, was a feat of engineering that required years of continuous labor, the diggers working in shifts with picks and hammers, the shaft braced with timber as it descended, and the spoil lifted to the surface in buckets by a treadwheel hoist, the same kind of hoist that was used to lift the stones of the walls. The well was lined with stone to prevent collapse, the stone being laid in courses that were bonded to the rock of the shaft, and it was provided with a spiral stair that wound around the shaft, allowing the garrison to access the water even if the hoist was damaged by enemy fire. The well was located in the innermost ward of the castle, where it could be defended even if the outer defenses were overrun, and it was often the site of the castle's final stand, the last redoubt of a garrison that had lost everything except its access to water. The Templar well was a symbol of the order's determination, a physical testament to the principle that no labor was too great if it served the defense of the Holy Land, and the brothers who dug it knew that they were creating the lifeline of the castle. The distribution of water within the castle was achieved through a network of pipes, channels, and aqueducts that carried the water from the cisterns and wells to the points of use: the kitchens, where it was used for cooking and washing; the baths, where the brothers could cleanse themselves of the dust and blood of the siege; the latrines, which were flushed by a continuous stream of water; and the drinking fountains, where the brothers could fill their water skins. The pipes were made of terracotta, lead, or carved stone, and they were laid beneath the floors and within the walls, invisible to the casual observer but essential to the functioning of the castle, the water flowing through them with a soft murmur that was the constant background music of the garrison's life. The Templar latrines, which were flushed by a continuous stream of water from the cisterns, were a sanitary innovation that reduced the incidence of the diseases that ravaged other medieval garrisons, the dysentery and the typhus that killed more soldiers than the swords of the enemy. The latrines were a source of quiet pride for the order, which considered cleanliness a form of discipline, and their design was a product of the same systematic engineering that had produced the Talus and the concentric walls. The water system of a Templar castle was a circulatory system, a network of arteries and veins that carried the lifeblood of the garrison to every part of the fortress, and its design was as carefully considered as the design of the walls themselves. The collection of rainwater was a matter of precise engineering, and the Templars designed the roofs and courtyards of their castles to maximize the capture of the winter rains, the only reliable source of water in many parts of the Holy Land. The roofs of the great halls and the chapels were pitched to channel water into gutters, which fed into downspouts that directed the water into the cisterns, the gutters being carved from stone and the downspouts being built into the walls. The courtyards were paved with stone and sloped toward drains, and the entire surface of the castle was calculated to contribute to the water supply, every square meter of roof and pavement being a catchment area. The Templar engineers had measured the average rainfall of the region, a measurement that had been recorded over years of observation, and they had sized the cisterns to capture enough water during the wet season to last through the dry season, a calculation that required a knowledge of hydrology that was rare in the medieval world. The water system was not an afterthought, a feature that was added after the walls were built. It was an integral part of the castle's design, and its failure would mean the death of the garrison long before the walls were breached, the defenders dying of thirst while the enemy waited outside. The Templars also developed techniques for protecting the water supply during a siege, when the cisterns might be the only source of water for months on end and when the enemy would try every means to poison or deplete them. The water was rationed, with each brother receiving a measured allowance each day, and the rules specified the penalties for exceeding the ration, which could include the loss of the mantle and expulsion from the order, a spiritual death that was worse than physical death. The cisterns were guarded at all times, a brother being posted at the entrance to the cistern with orders to allow no one to approach without the commander's permission, and the water was tested regularly for signs of contamination, a task that fell to the brother physician, who was trained in the detection of poisons. The Templars also developed a system of emergency cisterns, small reservoirs that were hidden within the thickness of the walls and that could be used if the main cisterns were damaged or contaminated, the location of these emergency cisterns being a secret known only to the commander and his senior officers. The protection of the water supply was a matter of constant vigilance, and the Templar garrison knew that the loss of the water meant the loss of the castle, a knowledge that sharpened their attention to the cisterns and the wells. The water system of a Templar castle also served a defensive purpose beyond the mere provision of drinking water, a purpose that was integrated into the overall defensive scheme of the fortress. The moat, which surrounded many of the castles, was fed by the overflow from the cisterns, and it was stocked with fish to provide a source of food during a siege, the fish being a welcome supplement to the garrison's diet of bread and lentils. The moat also served as a barrier to mining, because any tunnel that attempted to pass beneath the moat would flood, drowning the sappers in their own excavation, the water of the moat being a more effective defense than any wall. The water from the cisterns was also used to extinguish the fires that could be started by Greek fire or by the incendiary arrows of the attackers, and a system of leather hoses and copper pumps allowed the defenders to direct a stream of water onto the flames, the pumps being operated by teams of sergeants. The water system of a Templar castle was a multi-purpose asset, a resource that was essential to the survival, the comfort, and the defense of the garrison, and its sophistication was unmatched by any other military force of the period, a sophistication that was the product of the Order's unique combination of monastic discipline and military engineering. The archaeological evidence of Templar water systems is abundant, and the cisterns and wells of the castles are among the best preserved features of the ruins, their underground location protecting them from the destruction that has befallen the upper works. The cistern of Safed, which was excavated by Israeli archaeologists in the 20th century, is a vast underground chamber with vaulted ceilings and plastered walls, capable of holding over 2 million liters of water, its size and its state of preservation a testament to the quality of the Templar construction. The well of Chastel Pellerin, which descends through the limestone of the promontory to the water table far below, is still visible today, its shaft a dark, echoing void that testifies to the labor that was invested in its construction, the diggers working for years to reach the water. The water systems of the Templar castles are a hidden chapter in the history of medieval engineering, a chapter that is only now being written, and the more we learn about them, the more we appreciate the genius of the men who built them, men who understood that the survival of the garrison depended on the water that flowed beneath the stones. The evolution of Templar gate defenses from the simple portals of the early castles to the multi-layered fortresses of the 13th century is a microcosm of the Order's entire architectural program, a story of continuous adaptation and improvement in the face of an ever more dangerous enemy. The earliest Templar gates, built in the 1130s and 1140s, were little more than heavy doors set into the curtain wall, protected by a single portcullis and flanked by square towers that provided only limited enfilading fire, a design that was adequate against the raiding parties and small armies of the early Crusader period, but that was quickly outmoded by the development of Muslim siege techniques. These gates were forced on several occasions in the early decades of the Order's presence in the Holy Land, the attackers breaking through the doors and storming into the courtyard, and the Templars, who recorded every such failure in their now lost archives, set about transforming the gate from a weakness into a strength. The gate of a Templar castle became a laboratory of defensive innovation, a place where new ideas were tested, refined, and incorporated into the design of the next fortress, and the result, by the early 13th century, was a gate system that was the most sophisticated of the medieval world, a system that was never forced in the entire history of the Templar castles that were fully completed. The first major innovation was the Barbican, the outwork that protected the approach to the main gate, a feature that we have already examined in detail and that represented a fundamental rethinking of the gate's function. The Barbican was followed by the development of the bent entrance, a configuration in which the passage through the gate turned at a sharp angle, usually 90 degrees, so that an attacker who rushed through the outer portal would crash into a wall and be forced to turn, exposing his flank to the defenders. The bent entrance was a simple but devastatingly effective idea, an idea that had been used in the Bronze Age gates of Mycenae and that the Templars revived and perfected. It broke the momentum of a charge, it prevented the use of a battering ram against the inner doors because the ram could not be maneuvered around the bend, and it created a moment of confusion that the defenders could exploit. The attackers milling in the confined space while the crossbow bolts rained down from above. The Templar gatehouse at Chastel Pellerin features a bent entrance of such complexity that the passage turns twice, forcing the attacker to navigate a zigzag of death under the fire of the murder holes and the arrow loops, each turn exposing a new flank to the defenders. The bent entrance was a device of pure geometry, a manipulation of space that turned the attacker's own momentum against him. The double gate system, in which the outer gate and the inner gate were separated by a killing space, was another Templar innovation that added depth to the gate defenses, a depth that meant the loss of the outer gate was not the loss of the castle. An attacker who forced the outer gate would find himself in a narrow, enclosed courtyard, surrounded on all sides by high walls, with the inner gate sealed before him and the outer gate now blocked by the press of his own advancing troops, the soldiers behind pushing forward while those in front tried to understand the trap. The defenders on the walls above would rain down fire from the murder holes, the machicolations, and the arrow loops, and the attackers, trapped in the killing space, would be slaughtered without being able to bring their own weapons to bear, their shields useless against the fire that came from above. The double gate system was a trap that was sprung the moment the outer gate was forced, and its effectiveness was such that by the end of the 12th century, it had become a standard feature of Templar castle design, a feature that was incorporated into every new fortress that the Order built. The portcullis system of a Templar gate was a feat of mechanical engineering that allowed a single sergeant to control the passage of the gate with a precision that was unmatched in other medieval fortresses, the portcullises being the iron teeth of the gate's mouth. The portcullises, which were made of iron bars set into a wooden frame, were suspended from chains that were wound around a windlass in the gatehouse above, the windlass being a massive wooden drum that was turned by a team of men or by a counterweight. The windlass was fitted with a ratchet and pawl mechanism that allowed the portcullis to be raised or lowered in increments, the ratchet clicking as the portcullis rose, and it could be released suddenly, dropping the portcullis with a crash that could sever the limbs of any attacker caught beneath it, the iron spikes driving through armor and flesh. The grooves in which the portcullis ran were cut into the solid stone of the gatehouse walls, and they were protected from attack by the crossbowmen on the flanking towers, so that an attacker who tried to jam the portcullis with a beam would be shot down before he could reach the groove. The Templar portcullis system was a product of the Order's mechanical ingenuity, and its reliability was a crucial factor in the defense of the gates, the portcullis never failing to fall when the order was given. The murder holes and arrow loops of the gatehouse were positioned to cover every square centimeter of the passage, eliminating the blind spots that could allow an attacker to shelter, the entire passage being a honeycomb of openings. The ceiling of the gate passage was a honeycomb of openings, each of which served a different purpose. Some were for dropping stones, some for pouring boiling water or oil, some for firing crossbows vertically downward, and some for the insertion of spears and lances, the defenders being able to attack the enemy from every angle. The floor of the passage was often sloped downward toward the entrance, so that any liquid poured from above would flow toward the attackers, carrying with it the filth and the dead that had accumulated during the siege, a tide of blood and water and oil that made the footing treacherous and that added to the horror of the assault. The gatehouse was a machine for killing, and its design was the product of a century of experience in the art of close-quarters defense, a design that had been tested and refined in the sieges of the Holy Land and that was never found wanting when the enemy came to the gate. The final defense of the gate, the inner doors, were the last barrier before the castle's interior, and they were constructed to withstand the most determined assault, a barrier that was the ultimate reserve of the gate defense. The doors were made of massive oak beams, bound with iron bands and studded with iron nails, the nails being designed to break the teeth of a battering ram, and they were backed by a series of bars and bolts that were operated from within the gatehouse, the bars being massive timbers that were dropped into iron brackets on either side of the door. The hinges of the doors were set into the solid stone of the walls, and they were protected from fire by a layer of wet hides that were draped over the ironwork during a siege, the hides being kept wet by a continuous stream of water from the cisterns. The inner doors were only breached on a handful of occasions in the entire history of the Templar Order, a testament to the effectiveness of the system that protected them, a system that had been designed to ensure that the gate, the weakest point of any fortress, was the strongest point of a Templar castle. The training of the gate garrison was as important as the design of the gate itself, for a well-designed gate is useless without a well-trained garrison to defend it. The Templar rules specified the duties of every brother who was assigned to gate duty, a set of procedures that had been refined over decades of experience, and that were drilled into the garrison until they were second nature. The watch commander was responsible for maintaining the readiness of the gate, inspecting the portcullises and the doors daily, and ensuring that the murder holes were supplied with stones, water, and oil, the supplies being replenished after every action. The crossbowmen on the gate towers were required to know the fields of fire by heart, and they practiced their aim against targets that had been placed at the known distances along the approach road, the targets being marked with the ranges so that the crossbowmen could adjust their aim accordingly. The gate garrison was drilled in the procedures for repelling an assault, including the signals that would summon reinforcements from the inner ward and the commands that would trigger the release of the portcullis and the opening of the murder holes, the entire garrison acting as a single, coordinated machine. The Templar Gate was a system that relied on the coordinated actions of dozens of men, and the discipline of the garrison was the final component that made the system work, the human element that turned the stone trap into a living defense. The legacy of the Templar Gate defenses can be seen in the great gatehouses of the late medieval period, the massive, multi-towered structures that became the signature of the royal castles of England and France, a legacy that was transmitted through the returning Crusaders who had seen the Templar castles with their own eyes. The gatehouse of Harlech Castle in Wales, with its twin round towers and its complex system of portcullises and murder holes, is a direct descendant of the Templar gatehouses of the Holy Land, its design brought to Britain by the Crusader King Edward I, who had seen the Templar castles during his time in the East. The gatehouse of the Bastille in Paris, the infamous prison that was stormed in the French Revolution, was another descendant of the Templar tradition, its massive towers and its defended passage owing their design to the gatehouses of the Crusader fortresses. The Templar Gate, born in the desperate struggle to hold the passes and fords of the Levant, became the standard for the castles of Europe, and its influence can still be seen in the fortress architecture of the modern age, a testament to the enduring quality of the Templar innovations. The Castle of Chastel-Pellerin, the Castle of the Pilgrims, is the most complete surviving example of Templar military architecture, and its design incorporates every innovation that the Order had developed over a century of fortress construction, a synthesis that makes it a textbook of medieval military engineering. The castle was built on a rocky promontory that jutted into the Mediterranean Sea, a site that was chosen for its natural defenses and its access to the sea, the promontory being cut off from the mainland by a deep fosse that was carved through solid rock. The fosse was filled with seawater by a system of sluice gates that harnessed the tides, a feat of hydraulic engineering that the Templars had learned from the Byzantine engineers of Constantinople, and it was wide enough to prevent the deployment of siege towers and deep enough to make mining impossible, because any tunnel would flood before it could reach the walls. The castle itself was a masterpiece of concentric design, with 3 layers of walls rising in terraces from the sea to the central keep, each wall higher than the one before it, so that the defenders on the inner walls could fire over the heads of the defenders on the outer walls, the entire castle being a single, integrated defensive system. The outer wall of Chastel-Pellerin was protected by a massive talus that rose from the sea, its surface polished to a glassy smoothness that deflected the stones of the Mamluk trebuchets, the stones skidding off and splashing harmlessly into the water, and the wall was punctuated by round towers at regular intervals. Each tower was designed to provide enfilading fire along the curtain wall and to serve as a self-contained strongpoint if the wall was breached, the towers being equipped with their own wells and their own stores of provisions. The towers were provided with arrow loops on multiple levels, and their machicolations projected over the base of the wall, covering the talus with a vertical rain of stones and bolts, so that an attacker who reached the base of the wall would be immediately subjected to fire from above. The outer wall enclosed a large outer ward, which contained the stables, the barracks, and the workshops of the garrison, the buildings being arranged so that they did not provide cover for an attacker who had entered the outer ward. The space between the outer and inner walls was a flat, open killing ground that was completely exposed to the fire of the inner wall, the ground being paved with loose stones that made running difficult and that amplified the sound of the attacker's approach. The inner wall of Chastel-Pellerin was higher and thicker than the outer wall, and its towers commanded a view of the entire outer ward and the approaches from the sea, the crossbowmen on the inner wall able to fire down onto any attacker who entered the outer ward. The inner wall was built on the highest point of the promontory, and its keep, A massive rectangular tower of yellow limestone rose above the surrounding walls like a sentinel, a final refuge that was equipped with its own well, its own granary, and its own armory. The keep was a fusion of the European dungeon and the Eastern Round Tower, a hybrid that combined the best features of both traditions, its walls thick and its corners protected by the towers that flanked it. The inner gate was offset from the outer gate, so that an attacker who forced the outer gate would have to traverse the entire length of the outer ward under the fire of the inner wall's crossbowmen, a journey of 100 meters of continuous death. The concentric design of Chastel Pellerin was so effective that the castle was never taken by storm, and its garrison of a few hundred knights and sergeants held it against the entire Mamluk army during the final years of the Crusader presence. The gate system of Chastel Pellerin was one of the most sophisticated ever built by the Templars, a multi-layered defense that turned the entrance into a labyrinth of death, a labyrinth from which few attackers ever emerged. The outer gate was protected by a Barbican, a walled enclosure that projected outward from the wall and that forced the attacker to negotiate a series of turns under the fire of the flanking towers, each turn exposing a new flank to the defenders. The Barbican was entered through a gate that was offset from the main gate, so that a charging enemy would crash into a solid wall of stone and be forced to turn, his momentum broken and his formation shattered. The passage through the Barbican was narrow, lined with murder holes and arrow loops, and the inner gate was a massive structure with double portcullises and a bent entrance, the attacker having to navigate a zigzag of death before he even reached the inner doors. The attackers who attempted to storm the gate of Chastel Pellerin were never able to reach the inner doors. They were slaughtered in the Barbican, their bodies piled against the walls, and the gate remained unforced throughout the castle's history, a testament to the effectiveness of the Templar gate system. The water supply of Chastel Pellerin was a feat of engineering that guaranteed the castle's survival in the event of a prolonged siege, a siege that could last for years without the garrison running out of water. The castle had no natural spring, but the Templar engineers constructed a system of massive cisterns beneath the outer ward, carved into the bedrock and lined with hydraulic cement, the cisterns being a hidden reservoir that could hold millions of liters. The cisterns were fed by a system of channels that collected rainwater from every roof and courtyard within the castle, the entire surface of the fortress being a catchment area that directed the winter rains into the underground chambers. The water was filtered and stored in a series of interconnected chambers, and the cisterns were ventilated by shafts that rose to the surface, the shafts being capped with stone grills to prevent poisoning. The cisterns were accessible by a stair that allowed the garrison to draw water even if the upper works were in enemy hands, the stair winding down into the darkness to the water below. The water system of Chastel Pellerin was a hidden fortress beneath the fortress, a dark, echoing labyrinth of water that sustained the garrison through the long months of the Mamluk siege, and its design was a masterpiece of hydrological engineering. The harbor of Chastel Pellerin was a strategic asset that made the castle virtually impossible to starve into surrender, a lifeline that connected the fortress to the outside world. The harbor was protected by a massive iron chain that stretched across the entrance, controlled by winches within the keep, the chain being raised to admit friendly ships and lowered to bar the enemy, and it was sheltered from the prevailing winds by the curve of the promontory, the harbor being a calm haven in the stormy Mediterranean. The Templar fleet, based at the castle, could resupply the garrison with food, weapons, and reinforcements from Cyprus, Italy, and France, the supply ships sailing in under the protection of the castle's crossbowmen and the chain being raised behind them. The Mamluk besiegers, who had no fleet capable of challenging the Templar ships, could only watch as the supply vessels entered and left the harbor at will, their frustration recorded by the Arab chroniclers. The harbor was the castle's lifeline, and its existence meant that the defenders could hold out indefinitely, no matter how many troops the Sultan arrayed on the landward side, the castle being a fortress that was fed by the sea and that could not be starved. The final evacuation of Chastel Pellerin in 1291, on the orders of the Grand Master after the fall of Acre, was a deliberate and orderly withdrawal, not a surrender, a withdrawal that denied the enemy the use of the fortress. The garrison, having held the castle for decades against the full might of the Mamluk Sultanate, demolished the walls and the towers with their own hands, the brothers working with crowbars and hammers to slight the fortress that they had defended for so long. The harbor chain was cut, The cisterns were drained, and the gates were burned, the castle being left as a ruin that the Mamluks could not easily repair. The garrison sailed away to Cyprus, the Templar ships carrying the surviving brothers and the treasure of the order, and they left behind the ruins that we see today, the walls that had withstood the siege of the Mamluks now lying in the rubble that the brothers themselves had made. The evacuation of Chastel-Pellerin was the end of the Templar presence on the mainland, and the castle, which had been the most formidable fortress of the Crusader states, became a tomb of stone on the edge of the sea, a monument to the genius of the men who had built it and to the courage of the men who had defended it. The ruins of Chastel-Pellerin, which are still visible today on the coast of Israel, are a pilgrimage site for students of military architecture, a place where the principles of Templar engineering can be studied in the stone, the walls still standing as they were left by the evacuating garrison. The talus of the outer wall still gleams in the sunlight, its surface as smooth as the day it was laid, the mason's work having survived the centuries with barely a blemish. The round towers still project from the curtain wall, their arrow loops sighting along the vanished approach road, the towers still commanding the fields of fire that they were designed to cover. The great cisterns still echo with the drip of water, their vaulted chambers still holding the water that falls from the winter sky, and the keep still stands, a gaunt silhouette against the Mediterranean sky, a sentinel that has watched the centuries pass. Chastel-Pellerin is a book of stone, a text that can be read by those who understand the language of military architecture, and its pages are the walls, the towers, and the gates that the Templars raised to hold the Holy Land, a legacy that endures long after the order itself has passed into memory. We have traveled through the stone pages of Templar military architecture, from the European keeps that were the order's first inheritance to the concentric masterpieces that were its final gift to the art of war. We have traced the evolution of the round tower, which eliminated the vulnerable corners of the square keep and which provided the enfilading fire that was the key to the Templar system of defense. We have examined the talus, which turned the walls into mirrors that reflected the fury of the enemy's artillery, and which made the scaling ladder and the mine useless. We have dissected the Barbican, the killing box that transformed the gate from a weakness into a strength, and we have explored the concentric plan, which turned the entire castle into a machine for the defense in depth. We have seen how the Templar engineers, drawing on the knowledge of the Armenians, the Byzantines, and their own hard-won experience, created a tradition of military architecture that was the most advanced of the medieval world, a tradition that allowed a few hundred knights and sergeants to hold a frontier against an empire. The Templar castles were not merely piles of stone, they were the physical expression of a strategic philosophy, a philosophy that understood that territory is held not by the sword that passes over it but by the wall that remains, the wall that stands long after the sword has been broken. The legacy of Templar military architecture is not confined to the ruins of their castles in the Holy Land, the silent stones that bake under the Middle Eastern sun. It is embedded in the very DNA of fortress design, a genetic code that has been transmitted down the centuries to the present day. The concentric plan, which the Templars perfected at Safed and Chastel-Pellerin, became the template for the great castles of the late Middle Ages, from the walls of Conwy and Beaumaris in Wales to the massive fortresses of the Teutonic Order in the Baltic. The talus, which the Templars had learned from the Byzantines and made their own, evolved into the sloped, earth-covered walls of the Tres Italiens, the artillery fortress that dominated European warfare in the 16th and 17th centuries, the walls of Vauban being the direct descendants of the Templar talus. The Barbican, that hellish passage of death, became the ravelin and the counterguard, the detached outworks that protected the gates of the bastion forts, the same principles of the offset gate and the flanking fire applied to the new context of gunpowder. The Templar innovations were not forgotten, they were absorbed, adapted, and perfected by the generations of engineers who followed, men who may never have heard the name of the order but who built on its foundations, the foundations that were laid in the desperate struggle for the Holy Land. The fall of the Templar castles in the final decades of the Crusader presence was not a failure of architecture. It was a failure of the political and demographic foundations that the castles were designed to protect, a failure that no amount of stone could prevent. The fortresses that the Templars built were capable of withstanding the assault of the most powerful armies of the age, and they did so repeatedly, holding out for years after the field armies that should have relieved them had been destroyed. The castles fell because the Crusader states had been bled dry, their populations reduced to a shadow by war, disease, and emigration, their treasuries exhausted by the constant demands of defense, and their allies in Europe weary of the endless war that consumed their treasure and their sons. The Mamluk Sultan Baybars, who conquered the Templar fortresses one by one, recognized the quality of the stone that he was reducing, and he ordered his own engineers to study the Templar designs, incorporating their features into the Mamluk citadels that still stand in Aleppo and Damascus. The Templar castles were destroyed, but their architectural DNA survived in the fortresses of the enemy, a testament to the quality of the Templar engineering that even the destroyers sought to learn from the destroyed. The rediscovery of the Templar architectural legacy in the 19th and 20th centuries, through the work of archaeologists and historians such as Emmanuel Guillaume Rey and later scholars, has allowed us to reconstruct the evolution of the Order's building program and to appreciate the sophistication of its engineering, a sophistication that was unmatched in the medieval world. The ruins of the Templar castles, scattered across the landscape of Israel, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, are a treasure trove of information for the student of medieval military architecture, each ruin a chapter in the story of the Order. The surveys, the excavations, and the digital reconstructions that have been conducted at sites such as Safed, Chastel-Pellerin, and Tortosa have revealed the details of the Templar construction techniques, from the quarrying of the stone to the mixing of the mortar, and they have allowed us to see the castles as they were when the white-mantled knights stood on their battlements, their crossbows trained on the approaches and their busant flying from the keep. The Templar architectural legacy is a living field of study, and each new discovery adds a piece to the puzzle, a puzzle that will never be fully completed because the Templar archives were destroyed, but that continues to yield its secrets to the patient work of the archaeologists. The enduring fascination with Templar architecture in the popular imagination, from the novels of Sir Walter Scott and Umberto Eco to the films of Ridley Scott and the video games of the Assassin's Creed series, is a testament to the power of the Templar vision, a vision that fused the monastic and the military into a single, compelling image. The Templar castle, with its stark, functional beauty and its aura of mystery and hidden power, is an icon of the medieval world, a symbol of the fusion of monastic discipline and military might that was the Templar ideal. The tourists who visit the ruins of Chastel-Pellerin or Chastel-Blanc are following in the footsteps of the pilgrims who, centuries ago, marveled at the walls that the Templars had raised, walls that seemed to be the work of giants rather than of men. The story of Templar military architecture is a story that continues to be told, and it is a story that will be told for as long as there are people who look at a stone wall and see the genius of the hands that laid it, the genius of the men who turned stone and mortar into the defense of a kingdom. The ultimate lesson of Templar military architecture is not about the thickness of walls or the angle of a talus. It is about the power of human creativity to overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges, a power that is the legacy of the Templar Order. The Templars, facing an enemy that outnumbered them by 100 to 1, an enemy that had access to the most advanced siege technology of the age, did not despair. They built castles that were the wonder of their age, fortresses that stood for centuries after their builders had perished in the flames of persecution, and they left behind a legacy that is written in stone across the landscape of the Holy Land. The Templar castle is a monument to the human spirit, to the refusal to surrender, and to the belief that with enough ingenuity and enough courage, a few can hold the line against the many. The stone web that the Order spun across the Levant has long since been broken, its threads snapped by the Mamluk trebuchets and the sappers' picks, but its strands still shine in the memory, a testament to the warrior monks who were the masters of the art of stone, the brothers who built the walls that held the Holy Land for 200 years. Their legacy is not the treasure that was never found, or the secret that was never revealed. It is the stones themselves, the walls and the towers and the gates that still stand, a silent army of stone that still guards the memory of the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. If this deep dive into the fortresses of the Templars has ignited your passion for medieval engineering and the relentless innovation of the warrior monks, then I ask you now to honor their legacy by becoming a part of our community. Strike that like button with the force of a trebuchet stone hitting a talus, and subscribe to Stories of Our History with the bell notification fully armed, so that you will ride with us on every new expedition into the past. Your comments are the mortar that binds our digital fortress. Share with me below which Templar architectural innovation you find the most brilliant, and what other chapters of the Order's extraordinary story you would like us to explore in future episodes. Share this video with your fellow history enthusiasts, and help us construct a community worthy of the Masons who built Safed and Chastel-Pellerin, a community that will keep the memory of the Templar castles alive for generations to come. Together, we can reach our goal of 1,000 likes and build a digital fortress that will stand as long as the stone walls that the Templars raised. I hope you enjoyed this content, and I'll see you in the next video.